Hi everyone, welcome back to Crime Whisper. I know many of you are here listening as you drift off to sleep. So before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now let's get into tonight's story. Story 1. The overlooked death of Lawrence Larry Holmes on 9/11. September 11th, 2001, a date burned into the memory of every American. It was the day everything changed, the day the sky fell, the towers crumbled, and the world watched in horror as lives were lost in real time while the world focused on ground zero, on smoke and steel and chaos. Another life was quietly slipping away, unnoticed, unreported, and ultimately buried beneath the weight of a national tragedy. This is the story of Lawrence Holmes, a man most people never heard about, but whose death, though overshadowed, was no less tragic. Lawrence, or Larry, as his friends called him, was 48 years old when he died, born and raised in Newark, New Jersey. He grew up in a neighborhood where survival came first and dreams came second. Life wasn't easy. Crime was everywhere. Opportunity rare. Larry wasn't a saint, but he wasn't a villain either. Like many kids in rough neighborhoods, he made mistakes, petty thefts, small-time trouble, things done out of desperation more than malice. But he outgrew that life. He wanted something better. He found work in construction, hard, honest labor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. His hands, calloused and scarred, had helped build homes, offices, lives. He wasn't the most skilled man on the crew, but he was the most dependable, always the first to arrive, often the last to leave. He had a wife, Evelyn, and a teenage son, Devin. They were his world. They were the reason he kept going. When things got tough, the reason he stayed clean, stayed grounded, stayed hopeful. The morning of 9/11, that Tuesday morning, Larry left for work like he always did. He kissed Evelyn goodbye, told Devin he'd be home for dinner. Just another day, just another job. He had a small remodeling project in Brooklyn, routine, familiar. Nothing about that morning gave any warning of what was to come. He got to the site early, around 8:30 a.m., greeted his foreman, Tony, and checked in with the crew. They were working on a house in a newly gentrified neighborhood. Just another job to finish. Then his phone rang. It was Evelyn. She didn't sound panicked, but her voice carried an edge. "Attention, Larry. Something's happening in the city," she said, confused. Larry walked over to the small break area, where an old TV sat. He turned it on, just in time to see the first images of the North Tower on fire. Smoke poured from the building, sirens, chaos. "What the hell?" he whispered. Evelyn's voice was still on the line, faint now, drowned out by the news anchor's panicked voices. The second plane had already hit the South Tower. The entire crew had gathered around the TV. No one spoke, no one moved. They just watched, frozen, as the world unraveled on live television. Terrorists, hijackers, collapsed, death. The anchors struggled to keep up. The truth came out in fragments, in disbelief, in horror. Larry, ever the realist, knew they had to make a decision. Their site was in Brooklyn, miles away from the towers, but proximity didn't matter anymore. The city was in free fall. The city was under attack. Larry's wife was at home. His son was at school, and he had no idea how or if any of this would end. He tried calling Evelyn. No signal. Tried reaching his son. Nothing. The lines were jammed. Communication across the city had collapsed. He had no way of knowing if they were safe, if the destruction was contained to lower Manhattan, or if something even worse was still coming. All he could do, like millions of others, was wait. Then the first tower fell, and not long after, the second. The sound of it, the collapse, the roar, the screams, was something Larry would never forget. It was like the earth itself had given way. "We need to get out of here," he told Tony, his foreman. "This job isn't worth dying for." Tony looked at him, hesitant. "You're right, Larry, but where do we even go? The subways are shut down. The streets are a mess." Larry didn't have a plan. He just knew he needed to get home. "I'm going. I need to be with my family," he said, and with that, he grabbed his jacket and left the site. He was walking down Fifth Avenue when it happened, still shaken, still thinking about the towers. Larry didn't notice the two figures step out from a side alley. They were young, barely more than Boise. Didn't see them until one of them shoved him hard, knocking him off balance. "Give us your wallet," one of them demanded, his voice shaking with fear, urgency, or maybe both. Larry froze. His instincts took over. He wasn't a fighter, but he wasn't going to just hand everything over. Either. He slowly reached for his wallet, trying to defuse the situation, but then he felt it cold steel pressing into his side. The second man had drawn a knife, and before Larry could even register what was happening, the blade plunged into his abdomen. The pain was blinding, sudden, a white-hot burst that spread through his body like wildfire. Larry staggered backward, clutching at his stomach. Blood seeped between his fingers. The two attackers moved quickly, pulled the wallet from his pocket, then shoved him down. The last thing Larry saw was their faces, not just fear or greed, but something colder. Rage, desperation, a look he couldn't name. Then they were gone, swallowed by the panicked crowd. Larry lay on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath him. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the noise. Sirens, screams, footsteps. He heard people approaching. Too late by the time the ambulance arrived. Lawrence Holmes was already gone. The investigation that followed was brief. There were no solid leads, no arrests. The city was in chaos, and Larry's death quickly became a forgotten footnote. Just another tragedy, in a day already overflowing with horror. His name was never listed alongside those who died in the towers. There were no candlelight vigils, no headlines, just silence. Evelyn never found out who killed her husband. She raised Devin alone, carrying the weight of that day for the rest of her life. For years, she would stand at the window, watching the street, hoping Larry might somehow walk back through the door, but he never did. Aftermath. In the days following the 9/11 attacks, the country was frozen in collective grief. But while the world mourned nearly 3,000 lost lives, families like Evelyn's were facing private, invisible losses of their own losses. No less devastating for Evelyn, that silence was unbearable. On the day Larry was murdered, she had been home, glued to the television, watching the chaos unfold in Manhattan. The phone lines were still jammed. She couldn't reach him. She didn't even know if he was still alive then. Hours later, long after the towers had collapsed and the smoke had begun to settle, the phone rang. It wasn't Larry, it was a police officer she'd never met, and his voice was gentle, careful. He told her that Larry's body had been found on a Brooklyn sidewalk, stabbed, robbed, left a DA robbery gone wrong. They said, but to Evelyn, none of it made sense. Not that day, not that news, not the way her husband's life had been so senselessly taken, and so easily forgotten. Aftermath of Larry Holmes's death. Larry was gone, taken from Evelyn in a senseless, brutal act that felt too cruel to be real. She couldn't understand it. How, in a world already falling apart, the love of her life could be ripped away so violently. He had always been her protector, her partner, and now he was just gone. The days that followed blurred together. There were funeral arrangements, people coming in and out of the house, murmured condolences, but Evelyn barely registered any of it. Her family did their best to support her, but their efforts felt distant. Nothing could touch the ache in her chest. She kept expecting Larry to walk through the door, to come in from the garage with oil-stained hands and tired eyes, to turn on the old radio and hum along to the classic rock songs he loved, but he never came. The house felt emptier than she could bear. Even though his presence lingered in every corner, his jacket still hung by the door. His coffee mug still sat in the sink. It was as if time had stopped, but the world kept turning without him. Devin, their 15-year-old son, took the loss harder than Evelyn could have imagined. He was old enough to understand death, but not old enough to process it. He stopped talking to his friends, his grades slipped, he spent most of his time in his room, lost in old rock songs, the same ones Larry used to play on weekend mornings. Music became his anchor, his way of keeping his father close, but nothing filled the void. The hole Larry left behind was too wide, too deep. Devin didn't have the words for his grief. And Evelyn didn't know how to reach him. She tried to be strong. She tried to hold herself together for Devon, but at night, when the world was quiet, she cried. She missed the sound of Larry's voice, the warmth of his embrace. They had built a life together, a modest, beautiful life, and now, it felt like it was crumbling around her. The police investigation into Larry's death went nowhere, overshadowed by the enormity of the 911 attacks. His murder barely made a blip on anyone's radar. The detectives were overwhelmed. Stretched thin, they took a report, asked a few questions, and then moved on. There were no suspects, no clear leads. The few people who had seen Larry lying on the sidewalk were too shaken to remember anything useful. The attackers, just two faces in a panicked, fleeing crowd, vanished into the chaos. Case went cold, filed away, forgotten to the city. It was just another tragedy in a sea of tragedies, but to Evelyn, it was a gaping wound that never healed. She couldn't help but wonder, would it have been different if it had happened on any other day? If the world hadn't been consumed with death and fire and war? Maybe someone would have noticed. Maybe the police would have cared. Maybe someone would have looked for the men who stole her husband's life. But Larry's death, like so many others that day, was lost beneath the weight of histories. Sometimes Evelyn would catch a glimpse of Devon and see the same sorrow in his eyes that she felt every single day. They were bound by their grief, but they couldn't find a way to share it. She had lost her husband, Devon had lost his father, and though they lived under the same roof, the space between them only seemed to grow. Larry had taught Devon how to be strong, how to work hard, how to live with dignity. Now, those lessons echoed in Devon's mind, but they brought him pain, not peace. As the years passed, Evelyn tried to rebuild her life. She went to therapy, sat through support groups, even returned to church, hoping faith might bring comfort, but nothing softened the loss. Larry's memory followed her everywhere, and whenever she walked past the spot where he died, that quiet sidewalk in Brooklyn, the grief surged all over again. The injustice of it, the senselessness, the silence. Devon grew older. He started taking on odd jobs, saving money for college, trying to move forward in his own way, but his relationship with Evelyn became strained. He felt like she didn't understand his pain, and she didn't know how to reach the boy who had once run into his father's arms every time he came home from work. Devon didn't know how to express the anger he felt. Anger at the world, at the city, at the men who took his father, and deep down, anger at a God who let it happen. The unseen weight of grief. Devon carried the weight of his father's death like a shadow that never left him. He became more withdrawn, spending long hours away from home, not to heal, but to forget. But the truth was, neither he nor Evelyn could outrun the pain. Every year, September 11th reopened the wound the world remembered, the fallen towers, the victims, the headlines. But for Evelyn and Devon, the date marked something far more intimate, a personal devastation, the day their world shattered. Not just because of what happened to the country, but because of what was taken from them. Their grief wasn't televised. There were no flags lowered for Larry Holmes, no national silence for his stolen life. It was a quieter loss, but it was a loss just the same in the wake of tragedy. So many stories go untold, lives, forgotten deaths, unspoken. Larry Holmes's was one of them, a single, tragic moment buried in the chaos of a larger catastrophe. For Evelyn and Devon, the years that followed were filled with aching silence and unanswered questions. Their lives became a delicate balancing act, trying to rebuild while carrying the invisible burden of grief. They learned to live with it, but it never got easier. Eventually, Evelyn made the painful decision to leave their home, the place where she and Larry had built their life together. Every corner held memories, the hum of his radio in the garage, the smell of his aftershave in the hallway, the dent in the sofa where he always sat. She moved into a small apartment in a quieter part of the city, but even there, surrounded by strangers, the loss followed her. Sometimes she would catch herself waiting for the sound of his keys in the door, waiting for a voice she hadn't heard in years. Devon changed too. He grew up, graduated high school, took a job as a mechanic. It wasn't the life he had once dreamed of. but it was one he carved out for himself. He moved into a small apartment of his own and tried to move forward, but the anger stated clung to him like smoke, always in the background, always burning anger at the men who killed his father, anger at the city that forgot, and at a world that had moved on. His relationship with Evelyn became strained, distant. They shared a home once, they shared blood, but they had never found a way to share their grief. As the years passed, the murder investigation faded into silence. There were no follow-up calls, no new reports, no late-night updates from detectives. The file was cold. Larry Holmes's murder had become nothing more than a footnote, one man's death in the middle of the deadliest day in American history. There were no candlelight vigils for Larry, no engraved names, no place where his memory was preserved. The injustice of his death was buried beneath the larger story of a country in mourning, but Evelyn never stopped looking for answers. She visited the precinct more times than she could count, always hoping. Even when hope made no sense, she'd sit in the waiting area, eyes drifting across the faded bulletin boards and the dusty photos of missing persons, willing someone to remember to care, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until years later, when Evelyn was preparing to move again, this time out of the apartment she had retreated to after Larry's death, that something changed. She was sorting through old boxes in the attic. Most of them were filled with memories she hadn't touched in years. Photos from their wedding day, snapshots of family vacations, drawings Devon had made as a child, and then, at the bottom of a worn-out shoebox, she found something else. "See," police reported, was old, yellowed at the edges. The ink slightly faded. She thought she had seen it before, but as she scanned the document, something jumped out at her. Asterisk, a name buried halfway down the page in a paragraph she had somehow never fully read, was the mention of a witness, a young woman who had seen something. Her statement was vague, unclear, but it was something after all these years. A potential lead conclusion. Story 1. Evelyn's fight for justice. The witness had seen two men running from the alley where Larry had been attacked. She hadn't been able to describe their faces in full, but she remembered one thing clearly: a tattoo, bold, distinct, something that stood out. Evelyn's heart pounded as she reread the report after all these years. It was the first real clue, a sign that someone might know what happened. That day she called the detective's office immediately, clutching that small thread of hope. The officer who answered was kind but cautious. The original detective had long since retired, and the file had been closed for over a decade. Still, he agreed to dig into the archives to see if anything remained. Weeks past, Evelyn waited in a haze of anxiety and longing. She knew the trail had gone cold. She knew the city had moved on, but she hadn't. Not from Larry, not from the silence hand. Then the call came. The detective had tracked down the witness. She was living in a quiet town in upstate New York, though the years had passed. She hadn't forgotten that night. In fact, she remembered the tattoo in sharper detail, a symbol that matched one associated with a known local gang. Suddenly, what had once felt impossible became a breakthrough. Over the following months, Evelyn worked alongside the detective, slowly rebuilding a case long abandoned. They traced the tattoo to a small-time gang involved in petty theft and street crimes during the early 2000s. It was there they found a name: Marcus "Slick" Carter, a man with a long history of violence, a reputation for disappearing when things got serious. Eventually, they had enough. Marcus Carter was arrested and charged with the murder of Larry Holmes. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, legal hurdles, and fading witnesses. But this time, Evelyn didn't let go. She had spent too many nights in silence to turn back now. Years after that fateful day in 2001, she sat in the courtroom and watched as Marcus Carter was sentenced. It was a bittersweet moment, a kind of closure, but one laced with pain. Nothing could bring Larry back. Nothing could give Devon the father he had lost. But Evelyn had done what the system couldn't. She had found justice on her own terms. As Carter was led away in handcuffs, Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not happiness, but Larry Holmes may have been forgotten by the headlines, but in that courtroom, he was no longer just another unsolved name in a cold case file. He was a husband, a father, a man whose life mattered, and Evelyn had made sure the world would never forget that story to a crime. In the shadow of tragedy, on the morning of September 11th, 2001, just hours before the world changed forever, another tragedy was quietly unfolding, hidden in plain sight. While America's eyes would soon turn to New York, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania, a far more personal, equally devastating story was playing out in the heart of Philadelphia. That was the day 38-year-old David Martinez's life came to a violent and untimely end. David was a beloved figure in Philadelphia's Spanish-speaking community, the son of Mexican immigrants. He had been raised in a working-class neighborhood where opportunities were few, and ambition often meant survival. But David had something more, a relentless drive to give his family a better life. By his late 30s, he had succeeded in building something of his own, a modest but thriving auto repair shop on the outskirts of the city, known not just for its skilled work, but for its honesty. Customers came back again and again, not just for service, but because they trusted him. David was a man who believed in hard work and loyalty, in giving people second chances. But on that morning, a morning already marked for devastation, David Martinez became the victim of a crime rooted not in ideology, but in betrayal, greed, and calculated violence. Story 2. A murder in the shadow of tragedy. David Martinez believed in hard work. He had poured his soul into building his auto repair business from the ground up, earning every dollar, every ounce of respect. But success came with a cost. With growth came pressure, financial burdens, personal ambitions, and eventually, a slow, suffocating entanglement in a world of criminal temptation he had fought hard to avoid. And lurking in that world was someone from his past, Jorge Rivera, childhood friend. Once like a brother, they had grown up on the same streets, shaped by the same struggles. But where David had taken the hard road toward honest work, Jorge had veered off, pulled into the shadows of addiction, petty crime, and increasingly reckless decisions. Over the years, Jorge had approached David with business opportunities. Shady deals, get-rich-quick schemes that danced on the edge of legality. Every time, David had said no. He had worked too hard to lose everything, chasing shortcuts, but Jorge didn't see it that way. To him, David's rejection felt personal, a betrayal of the loyalty they once shared. And as David's business thrived, Jorge's resentment deepened. He began to see David's success not as earned, but stolen proof that he had been left behind. That bitterness would eventually explode into violence. The morning of September 11th, 2001, Jorge made one final attempt. He showed up at David's garage around 10:30 a.m., as the nation was still reeling from the first harrowing images out of New York City. Jorge was desperate, volatile, and this time, he was armed. He pitched one last scheme, a high-stakes car theft operation he swore would make them both rich. But David, seeing the desperation in his old friend's eyes, turned him down again firmly. Finally, he told Jorge he was done, that he had worked too hard to throw it all away. But Jorge couldn't take it. In his twisted logic, David had become the enemy, someone who had abandoned their roots, someone who needed to be punished. The confrontation turned. Heated shouts echoed across the garage over the clatter of tools, the hum of machinery, the flickering overhead lights. Jorge accused David of thinking he was better. David pleaded with him to walk away, to turn things around, but Jorge didn't come to talk. He came to end things in a sudden burst of rage. He pulled out a handgun. 2 shots rang out, one hitting David in the chest, the other in the abdomen. David crumpled to the concrete floor, blood pooling beneath him. Jorge stood over his childhood friend for a moment, paralyzed by what he had just done. Then he ran. No call for help, no remorse, just silence. It wasn't until later that day, as David's employees arrived for their shifts, that the horror was discovered. By then, the country was in chaos, America was under attack, and the murder of a small business owner in Philadelphia, barely registered on the national radar. Police responded swiftly, but their attention was divided. With no sign of forced entry or robbery, and no nearby witnesses, The case stalled in its early hours. The garage sat on a quiet block. Nobody had seen Jorge come or go. The city was consumed by a far greater tragedy. It would take weeks for the investigation to gain traction in. When it did, it was by accident. Rivera was finally apprehended during a routine traffic stop in a nearby city at first. He denied everything, but investigators had been quietly working behind the scenes, gathering evidence, tracing his movements as the walls closed in. Jorge cracked he confessed not just to the shooting, but to the anger, the jealousy, the plot, the betrayal that had turned into murder. David Martinez's death might have been drowned out by the noise of a nation in mourning, but for those who knew him, his family, his community, his son, it was a wound that cut just as deep. Conclusion: the loss of David Martinez. When Jorge Rivera finally confessed to killing David, he told detectives it had been a moment of desperation, a fit of rage fueled by rejection, jealousy, and the crushing weight of poverty. David had turned down Jorge's criminal offers too many times, and in Jorge's warped mind, that final refusal felt like abandonment. He snapped. Jorge was charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery, as investigators discovered that, in the chaos following the shooting, he had stolen several valuable tools and parts from David's garage. The trial was quiet, somber, a courtroom filled with sorrow and disbelief. Friends, family, co-workers, they all stepped forward to speak of David's character, of his resilience, his kindness, his unshakable dedication to family, but their voices were drowned out in the national roar of grief. David's death, tragic as it was, happened just hours before the September 11th terrorist attacks, and in the storm of global headlines and national mourning, his murder became a footnote, an intimate loss buried under a historic catastrophe. But for the city of Philadelphia, and especially for David's family, it was a wound that would never fully heal. Authorities continued to probe deeper. In the years that followed, they believed Jorge's actions weren't just driven by personal rage, but possibly linked to broader criminal circles in the city. The case technically remained open for years, as threads of Jorge's life unraveled further, under law enforcement scrutiny. Still, for David's family, none of it mattered. No investigation, no verdict, no prison sentence would bring him back for his mother, Rosa Martinez. The grief was both private and public. She had lost her son, a proud self-made man who had promised her a better life. In a moment of violence that felt like betrayal, the image of David lying lifeless on the garage floor haunted her dreams. Even as the world moved on from 9/11, Rosa remained trapped in that mourning. His younger sister, Isabella, bore a grief that ran just as deep. She had been his closest confidant, the one he turned to when things got tough. They had survived childhood together, side by side, and she had watched him rise above it all. But the day he died, her world shattered, and the healing never came. Isabella carried more than sorrow. She carried rage at Jorge, at the senselessness of it all, and most painfully, at herself for not seeing it coming, for not stopping it. But perhaps the most silent pain belonged to David's son. Alex was just 5 years old when his father was killed. Too young to understand what death really meant, but old enough to know something had been taken from him. He was raised by his mother and grandparents, surrounded by love, yes, but always aware of a hole in the center of his life. As he grew, he asked questions. Who was my dad? What was he like? Why did he leave? The answers were never enough. His grandmother would tell him that David had been a good man, honest, hard-working, and full of dreams. But the stories were fragments, hazy memories, missing pieces of a man he would never truly know. As Alex entered his teenage years, the absence became louder. He began to question the fairness of it all. Why would someone like David, a man who hurt no one, who gave everything, be taken so violently, so suddenly? And as much as Rosa tried to protect him from the darker truths, she knew she couldn't shield him forever. Someday, she would have to explain it all, that David's killer had once been his friend. That jealousy and greed had driven a man to extinguish a life, not for revenge, not for justice, but for money. But for now, Alex tried to move forward. He focused on school friends, his future, a future that David had once dreamed for him, yet every achievement, every milestone, birthdays, graduations, first jobs, carried a dull ache, a quiet emptiness, the kind that only comes when someone who should be there isn't. Over the years, the investigation into Jorge Rivera's life revealed tangled links to organized theft rings and criminal operations across city lines, but for the Martinez family, those discoveries brought little peace. David's murder was never just about crime, it was about trust, and the terrible price of betrayal. In the shadow of one of America's darkest days, another tragedy unfolded, unnoticed by most, unforgettable to a few. David Martinez's life ended not in a blaze of history, but in the silence of a garage, at the hands of someone who once called him brother, and that silence still echoes the web behind the murder. As detectives delved deeper into the investigation, it became clear that Jorge Rivera's crime wasn't just an act of impulsive violence, it was the tip of a much larger, darker network. The items stolen from David's garage weren't random, they were traced to a string of high-end car thefts that had plagued Philadelphia for months. Police began to piece together a broader picture. Jorge had been working closely with a ring of organized criminals, trafficking stolen vehicle parts and entire cars across state lines. He wasn't just desperate, he was ambitious, a small-time hustler trying to climb the criminal ladder, no matter who he had to use or hurt in the process. And David, tragically, had been central to that ambition. Jorge had believed that David's successful auto repair business could be the perfect front, a legitimate-looking operation to funnel stolen parts through. But when David refused to take part, Jorge didn't just feel rejected. He felt threatened. That rejection, combined with Jorge's growing resentment and jealousy, turned deadly. While Jorge was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and armed robbery, investigators knew the story didn't end with him. The crime was personal, yes, but it was also strategic. Jorge had hoped to eliminate someone he viewed not just as a friend, but as competition. What unfolded during the investigation was a chilling web of betrayal. Jorge had been courting other criminals in the area, promising profits and stolen merchandise. He had planned to siphon valuable parts from David's shop, quietly at first, but when David refused to play along, Jorge saw no other way forward to him. David became a barrier, and in the cold logic of the world Jorge had chosen, barriers had to be removed. The murder wasn't just a moment of rage, it was premeditated, calculated. A mix of old friendship and new envy, twisted into something lethal. And, tragically, David had no idea how dangerous Jorge had become. As the trial approached, the world outside was already in mourning. The attacks of September 11th had shaken the nation to its core, but for the Martinez family, that national grief only deepened their private pain. Their tragedy felt swallowed up by a larger one, but they refused to let David's death be forgotten. They sat through every day of the trial, every testimony, every gruesome detail of Jorge's plan, and when the conviction finally came, it brought some relief, but not peace. Justice, after all, doesn't restore a life, it simply ends a chapter. In the years that followed, Rosa, Isabella, and young Alex each struggled to cope in their own ways. They remembered David not for the violence that ended his life, but for the love he gave in it. He was more than a victim, he was a devoted father, a son who kept his promises, a man who had clawed his way out of hardship to build something lasting, and that they decided would be his legacy. The impact of his death rippled outward. David's shop, once filled with the clatter of tools and the warmth of laughter, grew quiet. Rosa had tried to keep it open after his passing, hoping to preserve his dream, but the emotional toll was too great, and the burden of running it alone proved too much. Eventually, she sold it. The space changed hands, the neighborhood changed, too, slowly swept up in gentrification. New faces moved and new businesses, but for those who remembered David, nothing ever quite filled the void. Isabella, now in her 30s, eventually left the area. The memories were too heavy. She put herself through college, became a social worker, and started a family. all while carrying her brother's memory with her. But the shadow of David's death never truly left her. It became the silent companion behind her triumphs, the quiet ache beneath her joy. Alex, meanwhile, continued to grow. The boy who had lost his father before he truly knew him was becoming a man, and though he never got the chance to hear his father's voice or learn his lessons firsthand, he carried his father's name with pride and a quiet, burning resolve to live a life that would have made David proud. Closing line option, voiceover tagline style. In a world forever changed by national tragedy, one family bore a second heartbreak, quieter, more personal, but no less devastating. David Martinez was lost, not to history, but to betrayal, and those who loved him have never stopped remembering the weight of memory for Isabella. The grief never fully left, it lingered, a silent force that shaped every decision she made. The anger she had felt as a teenager, raw and unresolved, transformed over time but never truly disappeared. It bled into her work, into the way she cared for others, especially those families shattered by violence. Much like her own had been, she had tried to fill the hollow space her brother's death left behind with a career, with motherhood, with purpose, but part of her remained frozen, stuck in that terrible moment when David was stolen from her, brutally and without warning. Alex, now in his early 20s, had a different relationship with the past. He had grown up hearing stories about the kind of man his father had been: kind, hard-working, loyal, and he carried that legacy with pride. But there was also distance in his remembrance, a kind of emotional detachment that had quietly built over the years. He had never wanted to place his father on a pedestal. He understood that David, like anyone, was imperfect still. He felt the weight of his absence every time life got hard. He often found himself wondering, what would my father say if he were here? What advice would he give me? No answers ever came. What comfort he found came from Rosa, his mother. She had weathered more pain than most people ever would, and yet she had endured after losing David. Rosa had kept going, raising her children, paying the bills, holding the pieces of their broken world together. There was strength in that, but there was also quiet sorrow, a stillness to her presence that spoke volumes. She had survived, yes, but she had paid for that survival in ways no one else could truly understand. The sentence. As for Jorge Rivera, the man who had once called David a friend, the justice system eventually caught up with him after a lengthy trial. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The defense tried to portray Jorge as a desperate man, a victim of his own bad luck and bad choices, but the prosecution made it clear this wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned, premeditated, a betrayal rooted in jealousy, greed, and years of pent-up resentment. The jury agreed behind bars. Jorge remained bitter on occasion. He would mention David to other inmates, not with remorse, but with justification. He spoke as though he'd been wronged, as if his hand had been forced. But those who knew the full story saw through it. Even in prison, Jorge refused to face what he had done. He spent most of his time in isolation, not because he was threatened, but because he rejected the company of anyone who didn't share his worldview. He clung to his narrative that he'd been backed into a corner, that life had cheated him, but somewhere deep inside, Jorge knew the truth. He hadn't just taken another man's life, he had destroyed his own in the process. David's legacy in the broader Philadelphia community. David Martinez's death became another entry in a long list of senseless killings, but for those in the local Spanish-speaking neighborhoods, it hit harder. David wasn't a stranger, he was one of them. A first-generation success story, a man who had worked hard, built a business from the ground up, and refused to cut corners. He had played by the rules, and he had been killed for it. In the weeks after his murder, local discussions grew louder. Conversations in barbershops, churches, and community centers turned to the allure of crime. How easy it was for young men to get pulled in, especially when money was tight and opportunity was scarce. David had represented hope. His death was a gut-wrenching reminder that even the honest could fall prey to those who weren't. Still, his story did not end in tragedy. Along it became a lesson, a legacy, a quiet but powerful force that lived on through Rosa, Isabella, and Alex. They carried him with them, in the smallest of ways, in how they treated others, in how they handled conflict, in the values they held tightly even when the world felt unkind. Rosa would often speak about David's love for life, his infectious laugh, his relentless dream of building something better for the people he loved. That memory never faded, even as years passed, even as the city around them slowly changed. Philadelphia was transforming, violence giving way to revitalization, old storefronts becoming new spaces, and new families moving into neighborhoods once filled with pain. But for those who had known David, his absence remained a quiet, ever-present ache. His life, though cut short, had left an imprint, not just in the hearts of those he loved, but in the soul of the city itself. Optional closing line. Voiceover style. Some stories end with justice, others with silence. David's ended with both, and yet, somehow, with neither, his memory didn't fade. It lived on, not in headlines, but in the people who loved him enough to carry it forward. Story 3. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, as the world braced for an unimaginable tragedy, a quieter, more personal horror unfolded in a quiet Chicago neighborhood. The body of Michael Dunn, a prominent real estate broker, was discovered inside his luxurious townhouse, a home that once symbolized ambition, success, and high society. It was his wife, Claire, who found him. She had just returned from her morning jog and entered the master bedroom to find Michael lying motionless. A single bullet wound in his chest. Police were called immediately. What initially appeared to be a domestic tragedy would soon unravel into a complex web of secrets, rivalries, and betrayal. Michael Dunn had been a man of influence, deeply entrenched in the Chicago real estate world. He was connected to wealthy investors, city officials, and developers, his success accelerating rapidly in recent years. He had just broken into the elite commercial property sector, securing multiple deals that could have elevated him into the upper echelons of the city's power. Elite, but beneath the surface of his soaring success, there were complications. Those who truly knew Michael understood. He lived a life of contradictions. He was a loving husband, a devoted father of two, and a generous philanthropist who supported local charities. Yet in business, he was cutthroat, truthless when chasing a deal, willing to sideline friendships and ethics for profit. That duality earned him equal parts admiration and resentment. Assigned to the case was veteran homicide detective James O'Connor. At 42, O'Connor had seen every form of human cruelty, but something about Michael's death unsettled him from the moment he arrived at the scene. He felt the truth was layered, buried beneath carefully constructed appearances. O'Connor began his investigation by speaking with Claire. She was visibly devastated, but there was a strange composure in the way she carried herself. "I don't know who would do this to him," she said, her voice trembling. "He was a good man, a loving husband, a great father. We had everything, or so I thought." Her words were filled with sorrow, but O'Connor noticed subtle inconsistencies, hesitations when discussing Michael's business. Something wasn't right. Following his instincts, O'Connor shifted focus to Michael's professional life. It didn't take long to uncover trouble. At the center of it was Robert Sloan, Michael's longtime friend and business partner. The two had built their empire together, but in recent months, their relationship had begun to unravel. The tipping point appeared to be a skyscraper deal in downtown Chicago. Michael had pushed for a bold, high-risk acquisition that promised massive returns. Sloan, ever the cautious investor, had advised against it. Witnesses said their disagreements had become personal, with Michael secretly maneuvering to buy out Sloan's share of the company. Tensions escalated. Several employees recalled shouting matches between the two, and one even claimed that Sloan had threatened Michael, "If you screw me out of this deal, you'll regret it." Motive was clear, but could Sloan have followed through with murder? Digging deeper, Detective O'Connor uncovered even more troubling information. Michael had conducted several questionable deals over the years, including one where he acquired a downtown property previously owned by a crime syndicate. Long under FBI investigation, The purchase had drawn attention, not just from federal authorities, but from rivals within the criminal underworld. Michael had walked away from the deal richer, but possibly with a target on his back. The deal had raised numerous red flags. Whispers grew louder. Was Michael Dunn knowingly aiding in money laundering for the crime syndicate? The FBI had long suspected as much, though they were never able to gather enough evidence to formally charge him still. The suspicion clung to Michael's name like smoke, after Fire Detective O'Connor couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's murder wasn't just the fallout of a soured business partnership. Robert Sloan had a motive, but was he acting alone? Or was there someone else in the shadows? Someone with even more to gain from Michael's downfall? Then came the break. An anonymous tipster called in with a lead that would turn the investigation on its head. The caller claimed to have overheard a heated confrontation just days before the murder between Michael and a woman who, according to the source, was no stranger to Michael's inner circle. Her name was Emily Carter, a high-ranking executive at one of Michael's real estate firms. Her fingerprints were all over the skyscraper deal that had triggered the fallout between Michael and Sloan. But Emily's relationship with Michael wasn't purely professional. O'Connor's digging revealed they had been romantically involved, though they had kept the affair discreet according to the tip. The argument had centered on money. Emily was furious. Michael had promised her a sizable payout for her behind-the-scenes role in pushing the deal forward, but when it collapsed, he pulled out, leaving her empty-handed and enraged. Brought Emily in for questioning. She was cool, confident, impeccably put together at first. She denied any involvement in Michael's death, insisting she had nothing to hide. But as the interview wore on, cracks began to show under pressure. She finally admitted to the affair. She confirmed the fight, and when O'Connor pressed harder, the dam broke through tears and trembling hands. Emily confessed. She had felt betrayed, used. She had devoted months to the skyscraper deal, working behind the scenes to navigate the legal loopholes and smooth over conflicts. And when it all fell apart, Michael had refused to pay her the promised compensation, but Emily insisted she never intended to kill him. According to her confession, it was Robert Sloan who had pushed her over the edge. He had found out about her falling out with Michael and saw an opportunity. He approached Emily with a chilling proposal. If they killed Michael, they could split his wealth and take over the company he had built. Michael had tried to cut both of them out. Now, it was their turn to cut him out permanently. They devised a plan. Emily would lure Michael to his townhouse under the pretense of discussing a new business opportunity. Once he was inside, Sloan would be waiting. The plan unfolded just as they intended. Michael never stood a chance. Sloan pulled the trigger. Then together, they staged the scene to resemble a robbery gone wrong. Emily's confession was as cold as it was heartbreaking. She and Sloan had been driven by greed, each feeding off the other's anger and ambition. They had manipulated and used each other only to destroy the man who had once trusted them. Both their arrests sent shockwaves through Chicago's elite real estate world. As the investigation expanded, authorities uncovered more connections between Michael's firms and organized crime, confirming that his dealings had gone far beyond the legal gray area. He hadn't just been the victim of betrayal, he had also walked willingly into dangerous territory. In the end, Michael Dunn had built his empire on shaky ground. He played with power, greed, and corruption, and lost. His death served as a chilling reminder of the treacherous world in which he operated. A world where loyalty was conditional, and ambition could be deadly. Justice was served, but the cost was steep. Claire, his wife, was left to raise their 2 children alone, forever haunted by the violent end to the life they once shared. The empire Michael had worked so hard to build slowly unraveled in the years that followed. Investors withdrew, associates distanced themselves. The company's name became synonymous with scandal. Story of Michael Dunn's rise and fall echoed far beyond the courtroom. His legacy, once tied to wealth and prestige, became a cautionary tale, a grim parable about what happens when the pursuit of power overtakes the value of integrity. As the case against Emily Carter and Robert Sloan unfolded in court, more truths came to light. Witnesses, former colleagues, business partners, even friends, stepped forward, each offering a piece of the puzzle through their testimonies. The final portrait of Michael's life and death came into focus, one of brilliance and blindness, of ambition and arrogance, of betrayal cloaked in charm. It was the image of a man caught in a web spun from ambition, greed, and betrayal. The arrests of Emily Carter and Robert Sloan sent shockwaves through the real estate community, a circle that had once celebrated Michael Dunn as a visionary. Now they saw him as something else entirely, a man brought down by his own unchecked ambition. The trial became a spectacle. Local media, national outlets, and business insiders crowded the courthouse, hungry for any revelation about Michael's private world, his wealth, his relationships, and the final days of his life. And at the center of this media storm stood Claire, Michael's widow, forced to relive the darkest chapters of her life in a public courtroom. She never asked to be the face of this tragedy, but that's what she became. Her testimony was raw and deeply human. She spoke of the man she had loved, the father of her children, the partner she had once believed in. She described his drive, his tireless work ethic, and the success it had brought them. But she didn't shy away from the truth either. His ambition, she said, had become a double-edged sword. It pulled him away from his family. Late nights turned into long absences. Business calls overshadowed birthdays and quiet dinners. Their relationship suffered under the weight of his pursuit of power. Still, she never imagined that his business, his obsession, would cost him his life. As Claire bared her soul on the witness stand, the prosecution focused on laying bare the ruthless calculation of Michael's killers. They introduced expert witnesses to explain the premeditation behind the murder. Forensic evidence linked the murder weapon directly to Sloan, a gun registered in his name, with no plausible explanation for how it ended up at the crime scene. Surveillance footage sealed the timeline. Cameras captured Emily leaving Michael's townhouse shortly after the murder, her calm demeanor chilling in retrospects. Sloan's defense scrambled. They painted Emily as the mastermind, arguing that she had manipulated Sloan into playing a supporting role. But the evidence told a different story. Witnesses described Sloan's volatile behavior in the weeks leading up to the killing. Phone records revealed frequent, intense communication between him and Emily. They weren't strangers to each other's motives. They were co-conspirators together. They planned every step. When the verdict was finally read, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty, first-degree murder for both of them. Their sentences were swift: life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his final remarks, the judge didn't mince words. He condemned the sheer coldness of the crime, the way Emily and Sloan had betrayed someone who had once trusted them, how their greed and entitlement had led them to believe they were justified in taking a life. Though the courtroom drama eventually faded from headlines, the aftermath of Michael Dunn's murder rippled through Chicago's elite business circles. His former colleagues and partners were left to grapple with their own complicity. Some had distanced themselves from Michael in his final months, sensing danger in his dealings. Others had remained loyal only to feel betrayed by what came to light. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the trial was the spotlight it cast on the high-stakes world of real estate. It exposed a darker underbelly where million-dollar deals were sealed with whispers and backroom promises, and loyalty was often nothing more than leverage. The trial became a cautionary tale that in a world built on wealth and power, betrayal was just another transaction. Michael Dunn, once celebrated as a titan of industry, became a tragic symbol of ambition without limits. A man whose climb to the top ended in a fatal fall for Claire. The trial's end did not bring peace. The silence that followed was almost worse. The house they once called home became a mausoleum of memories. She chose to stay not because she wanted to, but because leaving felt like another kind of loss. Every corner reminded her of the man she loved and the brutal way he had been taken from her. She did her best to move forward. She poured her energy into raising their children, Alex and Sophie, trying to shield them from the weight of the legacy they had inherited. But some wounds don't heal. Alex, just 9 when his father was killed, struggled to make sense of it all. How could the man he had idolized, the man who read him bedtime stories, and coached his soccer games. Be the same person, wrapped up in lies, secrets, and shady deals. He would spend years searching for the answer. Michael's youngest son, Alex, was only 9 when his father was murdered. At that age, he was too young to fully grasp the complexities of Michael's business world, or the violent crime that had shattered their lives. But as Alex grew older, he began to uncover the tangled web of deals, secrets, and betrayals that had surrounded his father's life. Sophie, Michael's younger daughter, struggled with the loss in her own way. With few memories of her father, the absence left a heavy weight on her heart as she navigated the challenges of adolescence. Eventually, Claire could no longer bear the constant reminders held within the townhouse. She made the difficult decision to sell the home and move to a smaller house far from the life she had once shared with Michael. The real estate empire Michael had built also crumbled in the wake of his death. The scandals, combined with growing questions about his involvement in illegal dealings, pushed many former clients and partners to distance themselves, leaving the company in ruins. Years passed, and Emily Carter and Robert Sloan adjusted to their new realities behind bars. Emily, despite her role in the murder, quickly earned a reputation among inmates for her intelligence and charisma. Yet, with each passing year, the weight of guilt seemed to grow heavier on her shoulders. Robert Sloan struggled more profoundly with incarceration. He never fully accepted responsibility for his part in the murder, often trying to rationalize his actions. His bitterness, the same bitterness that had driven him to kill Michael, consumed him both inside prison walls and beyond. His efforts to justify the crime earned him little sympathy from fellow inmates. Michael's death left an indelible mark on those closest to him. His family, friends, and associates carried the pain of losing him so violently. His tragic end served as a stark warning within the business community, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the devastating consequences of betrayal, and how greed can destroy lives. Though Michael was a man of great wealth and success, his life had always been a delicate balancing act between personal and professional spheres. He had built an empire, but in the end, it was the choices he made, the people he trusted, and the darkness within those circles that led to his downfall. Michael's story, one of ambition, greed, and betrayal, echoed through courtrooms and boardrooms alike, serving as a somber reminder of the high price of success when pursued at any cost. As the years went on, the headlines faded, but Michael Dunn's legacy lingered within Chicago's business elite. The real estate industry, once buzzing with the promise of lucrative deals, reeled from the scandal whispers circulated about the ruthless, cutthroat world Michael had inhabited, raising uncomfortable questions about the moral limits of ambition and power. His empire, built on deals that crossed ethical lines, collapsed. Yet, the story of his tragic end continued to resonate, especially among those who had known him personally. Harold Manning, Michael's longtime business associate, was among the most affected, having worked closely with Michael for over a decade. Harold had been instrumental in growing the company, unlike many who distanced themselves after the murder. Harold remained connected, though reluctantly. He felt a deep betrayal, knowing Michael had been deceived by trusted partners, but he also wrestled with guilt over his own complicity in the company's darker dealings. Following the trial and convictions of Emily and Sloan, Harold tried to salvage what remained of the business, but the stain of scandal and the tragedy's shadow made recovery nearly impossible. Investors pulled out, partners left, and slowly, the firm Harold had helped build crumbled before his eyes. He questioned if the life he had built, fraught with moral compromises, was truly worth the price. Meanwhile, Claire Dunn fought to rebuild her family's future. She had always been the steady force behind Michael, the anchor that kept the family grounded amid his ambitions. But now, she faced an entirely different battle, one not fought in the boardroom, but in the quiet struggle to heal and move forward. Claire found herself battling not only the ruthless world of business and the betrayals of those who had once been close to Michael, but also her own overwhelming grief. She had lost the man she loved, the father of her children, and the life they had built together. The financial fallout from Michael's death left her in a fragile position, with the children's future uncertain and their college savings wiped out amid the public scandal. In the years following the tragedy, Claire kept a low profile, turning down interviews and even book deals that would have told her story instead. She focused on raising Alex and Sophie, shielding them as best she could from the harsh realities of their father's complicated life to her children. Michael was a hero, a hard-working man who had provided for his family. Claire knew the truth was far more complex, but she couldn't bring herself to shatter their idealized image of their father, not when so much had already been taken from them. As time passed and the decade wore on, Alex and Sophie began to forge their own paths, separate from the shadow cast by their father's legacy. Alex, who was just 10 when Michael was killed, chose to study law, driven by a desire to understand the criminal justice system and the motivations behind human behavior. He saw his legal career as a way to make sense of the tragedy that had shaped his childhood. More than that, Alex sought to find a sense of peace that his father never fully attained. His goal was to pursue justice not only for Michael's murder, but for all victims touched by the ruthless actions of people like Emily and Sloane. Sophie, younger than Alex, wrestled with her own memories of their father at just 6 years old when Michael was murdered. Her recollections were faint. What stayed with her most was the void his death left in their home. She turned to art. Painting and sculpture became her way to express feelings she couldn't put into words through her work. Sophie explored themes of loss and betrayal, confronting the darkness that had overshadowed her father's life. Art became her therapy, a way to reclaim some control over her childhood's narrative, a story that had been overshadowed by tragedy. Claire struggled with the path ahead. The passage of time had not softened the pain of losing Michael. She had spent years trying to rebuild the shattered pieces of her life, but still felt a lingering emptiness. Attempts to find comfort in new relationships fell short, unable to replace the life she had shared with Michael. Her memories, both the joyful and the painful, clung to her like a second skin. Sometimes she heard echoes of their arguments, the harsh words exchanged in frustration, or the quiet moments when they dreamed about the future in the stillness of night. Claire often found herself reaching for a life that no longer existed. For years, she avoided public mention of Michael. The world had turned against him, and she had retreated inward, determined to protect her children from the shadow of their father's tarnished reputation. But gradually, Claire found moments of peace in the laughter of her children. In the warmth of a new family she was beginning to build, she realized that while Michael's actions had forever changed their lives, she could still forge a path forward. She learned to forgive, though she would never forget the pain and loss that had defined so much of her story. Michael's death remained a lasting legacy in Chicago, a tale of ambition gone wrong, betrayal, and murder, in a world where power and greed often overshadowed morality. Yet, those closest to him moved forward scarred, but stronger. Alex and Sophie never forgot their father, but each found their own way to cope with the legacy he left behind. As for the perpetrators, Emily Carter and Robert Sloane served their sentences behind bars. Their once promising futures were consumed by choices driven by greed and desire for power. Ultimately, it was their own self-destructive actions that sealed their fate. Their crimes forever altered the lives of the Dunn family. But time, with its quiet persistence, had begun to heal even the deepest wounds. Claire, Alex, and Sophie faced the future, carrying the weight of the past, but also the strength to keep moving forward. Sophie might never fully forget the dark chapter that had marked their lives, but she and her family had learned to rebuild, piece by piece. And so, the story of Michael Dunn came to a close, a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragile nature of trust. Yet, his legacy would continue to resonate through the lives of his family, who found a way to survive the darkness and move toward the light. Story for the year 2000 to began with a chilling discovery in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Westfield, a small town just outside Chicago. On the morning of January 14th, the body of Nathaniel Hayes, a 42-year-old prominent businessman, was found in his upscale home. The scene was brutal. A life violently cut short as investigators arrived. It quickly became clear this was no ordinary homicide. Nathaniel's death was no accident. The question was, who had the motive to end such a prosperous life and why? Nathaniel Hayes had made a name for himself in the construction world over the years. His company grew from a modest startup into one of the leading construction firms in the Midwest, known for his sharp mind and deal-making prowess. Nathaniel was both wealthy and influential. People described him as ambitious, driven, and meticulous, traits that propelled his success but also earned him many enemies. As his fortune grew, so did the number of those who found themselves on the wrong side of his deals. It was no secret in the industry that Nathaniel was willing to step on others to get ahead. In some cases, he had ruined careers with a single decision. The first officers at the scene were met with a grisly sight. Nathaniel's body lay sprawled on the living room floor near a large bay window overlooking the sprawling garden. He had been shot multiple times. Blood splattered across the floor and furniture. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared stolen. The front door was left ajar. Unusual for Nathaniel, who was known for his cautious nature. Detective Jennifer Brooks, lead investigator, began her careful examination. The absence of struggle suggested Nathaniel had either been caught off guard or had known his assailant. The untouched safe in his study further supported the theory that robbery was not the motive. Detective Brooks suspected this was a crime of passion, personal vendetta, rather than a financial dispute. The first lead came from a late-night phone call Nathaniel had made just hours before his death. A neighbor, awake and watching TV, noticed Nathaniel's black SUV parked outside around midnight. Unusual behavior for him. The neighbor spotted a tall man with short dark hair, wearing a leather jacket, speaking with Nathaniel through the car window. In an intense conversation, the man disappeared quickly into the night. The description matched Daniel Pierce, a former employee fired months earlier after a heated dispute over a costly project. The failed project had cost Nathaniel millions, and Daniel had accused him of mismanagement and unethical practices. Their relationship soured quickly, ending with Daniel's dismissal and threats to ruin Nathaniel's reputation. Detective Brooks issued a warrant for Daniel's arrest. The pieces were falling into place. Daniel had motive and had been seen near Nathaniel's home before the murder, but when police searched his apartment, it was empty. Daniel had vanished. As the search for Daniel continued, more disturbing details about Nathaniel's personal life emerged. Interviews with those close to him revealed that, though he built an empire, he had done so at great personal cost. He had few true friends and was known for ruthless tactics in both business, and Nathaniel's ruthless ambition extended beyond business, spilling into his personal relationships. Several former colleagues testified that he had once promised to help them advance their careers, only to abandon them when their success began to threaten his own. In the construction industry, Nathaniel's reputation was one of cutthroat ambition and manipulation, leaving many embittered by their encounters with him. The investigation also uncovered a series of secret emails exchanged between Nathaniel and several high-ranking local government officials. These messages referenced questionable zoning permits, under-the-table duels, and covert negotiations related to land development projects. The evidence suggested that Nathaniel had been involved in bribing city officials to secure lucrative construction contracts, while several officials named in the correspondence were investigated. None were found directly connected to the murder, despite growing evidence against Daniel Pierce. Detective Brooks remained unconvinced he acted alone, although Daniel had motive. The precise, cold execution of the murder seemed out of character for him. The detective suspected another party, someone calculating who had collaborated with Daniel to bring Nathaniel down. A breakthrough came when forensic experts discovered a partial fingerprint on the murder weapon's handle. The print did not match Daniel's, but belonged to Robert Dillard, a wealthy investor involved in some of Nathaniel's recent projects. Robert had been a key financial backer, but had grown increasingly frustrated with Nathaniel's failure to deliver on promises. Rumors circulated that Robert had suffered heavy losses due to Nathaniel's mishandling of a major project. When questioned, Robert admitted to meeting with Daniel Pierce days before the murder. Their discussions focused on Nathaniel's business practices and mutual frustration toward him. Robert claimed their talks were limited to legal action possibilities, but police soon uncovered that their meetings were far more sinister, motivated by financial ruin. Robert conspired with Daniel, whose desire for revenge fueled their deadly plan together. Robert and Daniel orchestrated Nathaniel's murder. Daniel acted as the triggerman, while Robert provided resources and strategic planning. On January 27, 2002, both men were arrested in a coordinated operation and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution laid out a compelling case detailing the conspiracy between Daniel and Robert. Motive was clear: greed and vengeance. Executed with cold calculation, the trial stretched over several months, with both men attempting to deflect blame. Daniel's defense argued he had been manipulated by Robert out of misplaced loyalty, while Robert maintained he had only intended to discuss business matters. The jury remained unconvinced. Both were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Nathaniel Hayes' murder sent shockwaves through the local business community, leaving a scar that would take years to heal. His tragic death served as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the extremes people will reach to protect wealth and power for those who once admired Nathaniel's success. The case became a cautionary tale about how greed and betrayal can topple even the most untouchable figures. After the trial, the ripple effects continued. What initially appeared as a personal vendetta evolved into a broader commentary on the ruthless nature of ambition and power. The murder exposed the cutthroat realities of high-stakes real estate and business, where loyalty was fragile and alliances easily broken in pursuit of financial gain. Westfield's business community was forever changed. Many of Nathaniel's former associates, who had once sought to align themselves with his empire, now distanced themselves from his name and tarnished legacy. Several projects stalled as investors assessed the fallout from his criminal ties. Those who once praised Nathaniel found themselves facing awkward conversations with clients and colleagues. Some downplayed their past connections, while others openly condemned his unethical practices despite the collapse of his empire and damaged reputation. Some remembered Nathaniel differently to them. His death was a tragic loss. His early work had shaped Westfield's skyline and provided employment for hundreds. Nathaniel was more than a ruthless businessman. He was a man who left an undeniable mark on their town's landscape. His untimely death sparked ongoing debate about the true cost of success, whether climbing the corporate ladder was worth sacrificing relationships and integrity for wealth and power among locals. Nathaniel's murder became a philosophical question, a discussion that lingered long after the courtroom drama ended. For Claire Hayes, Nathaniel's widow, the conviction of Daniel and Robert brought little comfort. The sense of closure many expected never came, though justice had been served. Claire found herself trapped in conflicting emotions. On one hand, she felt relief that the perpetrators were held accountable, but on the other, a profound emptiness remained. On one hand, Claire grappled with the devastating realization that the man she had married, the partner and father of her children, had been leading a double life, far darker and more dangerous than she ever imagined. Her grief was deepened by the knowledge that Nathaniel's legacy was forever marred by the violent way in which he was taken from her and their children. Claire spent countless hours reflecting on her life with Nathaniel, struggling to reconcile the man she had loved with the man who had betrayed so many. She couldn't deny that Nathaniel had been charming, persuasive, and at times caring, but she also had to confront the harsh truth that he had made countless enemies along the way. She began to question whether she had ever truly known him, or if she had been blinded by his success and ambition, ignoring the darker sides of his personality. The weight of having overlooked his faults, focusing instead on his achievements and their comfortable life, became a heavy burden she found hard to bear. Her children, Alex and Sophie, were also left to pick up the shattered pieces of their world. Alex, 18 at the time of his father's murder, was suddenly thrust into the role of protector for his younger sister. The emotional impact of Nathaniel's death was difficult for him to process, especially knowing that his father's own actions had led to his demise. That murder robbed him of the chance to build a meaningful relationship with Nathaniel. Anger and resentment simmered beneath his surface, resentment not only toward his father but also toward the relentless media circus surrounding the trial. With reporters camped outside their home demanding comments, despite his efforts to remain composed, Alex often found himself lost in thought, torn between love for the father he once knew and hatred for the man who destroyed their future. Sophie, only 14, struggled more quietly, too young to fully grasp the complexities of her father's actions. She nonetheless felt the heavy emotional toll his murder had placed on their family. She often retreated into her art, spending hours painting and drawing as a way to express feelings she couldn't put into words. Her artwork grew more abstract and intense over time, reflecting the chaos and confusion she carried inside. Though she loved her father despite his flaws, the revelations of his betrayals left her heartbroken. Sophie was caught between preserving the good memories and wrestling with the anger she felt toward him for the destruction his actions had caused. As time passed, Claire focused on rebuilding a sense of normalcy for her children. She found solace in her community, leaning on close friends for support, determined to secure a better future for Alex and Sophie. Claire made the difficult decision to move away from the shadows cast by Nathaniel's legacy. She began working with a local charity, using her skills to help others affected by violent crimes. This new purpose gave her a way to channel her grief into something meaningful, a path toward peace in a world turned upside down for Alex and Sophie. The road ahead remained uncertain. They continued to navigate the complex emotions surrounding their father's death and sought to make sense of a life overshadowed by violence and betrayal. Both inherited their father's drive and ambition, but were determined to choose different paths, ones rooted in integrity and honesty. They vowed never to forget the lessons learned from tragedy as they pursued their own dreams. Meanwhile, Westfield, once proud of its association with Nathaniel Hayes and his booming business, now viewed his legacy with suspicion. Construction projects he initiated stalled or were abandoned. Development deals that once poured money into the local economy lay in disarray. Nathaniel's death had torn apart the community's fabric, and rebuilding trust would take years. The murder case became a stark reminder of the extremes people will go to in pursuit of power and wealth. It was a story of betrayal, of close friendships and partnerships torn apart by greed and revenge, but above all, it was a reminder of life's fragility and how one person's actions could profoundly affect many others. Nathaniel's story was not one of heroism or it was a cautionary tale about ambitions, cost, and the destruction born from the relentless quest for power. As the years passed, the shadow of Nathaniel's murder lingered over Westfield. The tragedy became an indelible part of the town's history, whispered in local gatherings and recounted as cautionary lore. His rise and fall, ruthless business dealings, and violent end were discussed at dinner tables and among curious minds, wondering how a man who seemed to have it all could meet such a brutal fate despite Daniel Pierce and Robert Dillard's convictions. Questions about Nathaniel's deeper involvement in the criminal underworld persisted. New details about his business practices and testimonies from previously silent witnesses began to surface. These revelations hinted at a more extensive web of corruption, suggesting Nathaniel had been more than just a ruthless businessman. He was potentially a key figure in a larger network of illegal activity. Rumors circulated about his involvement in money laundering, connections to organized crime, and even ties to a notorious underground syndicate operating across the Midwest. The possibility that Nathaniel played a significant role in this shadowy world complicated the murder case and fueled speculation that Daniel and Robert may not have acted alone had they been mere pawns in a much larger game. Detective Jennifer Brooks, who had led the original investigation, found herself drawn back into the case years later. Intrigued by these new developments, she began to dig deeper into Nathaniel's business dealings, searching for links to organized crime and other mysterious figures from his past in the years following the murder. The police department received anonymous tips about Nathaniel's connections to suspicious individuals. One particularly compelling lead came from a former associate who had worked closely with Nathaniel on a development project that had been haunted by financial discrepancies. A former associate now in hiding after receiving threats to his life revealed that Nathaniel had been deeply involved in manipulating city contracts. This was part of a larger scheme designed to funnel money into corrupt accounts controlled by a select group of powerful individuals. This revelation sent shockwaves through the police department. Detective Brooks and her team revisited old evidence and conducted new interviews. They discovered that several of Nathaniel's key business partners, including some from his closest circle, had disappeared in the years following his murder. Some were found dead under mysterious circumstances, while others had simply vanished without a trace. The detective also learned that multiple city officials once close to Nathaniel had been investigated for corruption, but were never formally charged. It appeared Nathaniel was not only engaged in shady business, but was likely a conduit for a far larger illegal operation. The investigation into these leads was slow and painstaking, as Detective Brooks pieced together a network of financial transactions, secret meetings, and coded communications. It became clear that Nathaniel Hayes had been playing a dangerous game. The stakes weren't just business deals, they involved the lives of those around him. Nathaniel had made enemies across all levels of society, in the business world, among his employees, and even within local government. As Brooks pressed forward, she wondered if Nathaniel's murder was only the tip of the iceberg. With the investigation back in full swing, she enlisted the help of several law enforcement agencies to track leads spanning multiple states. The focus was especially on the underground syndicate, hoping to uncover any connections between Nathaniel and this broader criminal network. Brooks soon found herself immersed in a shadowy world of encrypted messages, hidden accounts, and figures operating far beneath public view. While the renewed investigation into Nathaniel's ties to organized crime continued, the impact of his murder remained deeply felt by those closest to him. For Claire, Nathaniel's widow, the new revelations only deepened her pain. Processing the violent loss of her husband had been difficult enough, but now the suggestion that Nathaniel had been living a double life, one she never fully understood, it a fresh layer of betrayal to her grief. Claire had already been rebuilding her life and raising her children without Nathaniel, but now she was forced to confront the possibility that the man she loved was very different from the person she thought she knew. Claire's children, Alex and Sophie, also faced the weight of these new disclosures. For Alex, now in his 20s, learning about his father's involvement in criminal activities was a devastating blow. He had worked hard to distance himself from Nathaniel's legacy, determined to carve out a life free from the shadow of his father's name. Yet with the truth emerging, Alex wondered if he had been naive to believe his father's actions wouldn't affect his own future. Sophie, still wrestling with the trauma of her father's murder, found the new information hard to process. She had once idolized Nathaniel as a hero who built their family's life, but that image now lay in ruins, leaving her with more questions than answers. The revelations rippled through Westfield itself. The town, once proud of Nathaniel's contributions, now wrestled with the tarnished legacy of a man who was both a pillar of the community and a key player in the criminal underworld. City officials linked to Nathaniel's projects faced tough scrutiny, while the local press shifted from celebration to relentless pursuit of the truth behind his death. This media frenzy threatened the town's fragile economy as investors pulled out of ongoing projects, unsure how to move forward amid the turmoil. Amid the chaos, the investigation into Nathaniel's murder remained active. Detective Brooks and her team were resolute in uncovering every angle of the crime as they peeled back the layers of Nathaniel's life. More evidence surfaced, revealing a complex, multifaceted conspiracy. Whether his death stemmed from personal vendettas, business rivalries, or criminal enterprises. One thing was clear. Nathaniel Hayes' murder was no ordinary homicide. It exposed the dark underbelly of ambition, power, and greed. As the case evolved, new details threatened to unravel an even deeper web of deceit surrounding Nathaniel's life years later. The true nature of his legacy remains an open question, one that the town of Westfield and his family continued to grapple with. In January 2002, the small northeastern town of Brentwood was rocked by a brutal and baffling crime that would haunt the community for years: the murder of Emily Weston, a well-respected schoolteacher. The tragedy left the town stunned, struggling with unanswered questions as days turned to weeks. The investigation into her death uncovered secrets, lies, and a web of unexpected connections. Millie Weston, 32, was a beloved figure in Brentwood. She had taught at the local elementary school for nearly a decade. Colleagues described her as dedicated, warm-hearted, and deeply passionate about her work. She often stayed late to tutor struggling students and organized extracurricular activities beyond school. Emily was active at the community center, volunteering for events and charity drives. Her personal life was private but seemingly content. She lived alone in a modest two-bedroom house on the outskirts of town, keeping to herself but always offering a friendly smile or helping hand. On the morning of January 15, 2002, Emily's absence from school triggered the first alarm. Students arrived to find their homeroom teacher missing. An unusual occurrence for someone so reliable, who never missed a day without notice. A concerned colleague, worried about Emily's absence, reached out to her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Gloria Reynolds. Mrs. Reynolds, an elderly woman who lived alone, had grown close to Emily over the years and often kept an eye on her when Emily did not answer her door. Mrs. Reynolds decided to check on her personally upon arriving. Mrs. Reynolds found the door slightly ajar. The usually tidy yard was eerily still and quiet, a stark contrast to the usual neighborhood bustle. Pushing the door open and calling out, she was met with unsettling silence. Stepping cautiously inside, Mrs. Reynolds noticed the living room was in disarray, furniture overturned, books scattered, and an uneasy scent lingering in the air. In one corner, Emily lay motionless. On the floor, her body was sprawled in a way that clearly showed she had been attacked. Blood pooled around her head, and her once gentle face was marred by multiple blunt force injuries. Horrified, Mrs. Reynolds immediately called 911 within minutes. Police arrived and secured the scene. Detective Sarah Thompson, a seasoned investigator with the Brentwood Police Department, was assigned to the case, known for her keen eye and calm demeanor under pressure. Detective Thompson sensed immediately that this was no ordinary crime. The crime scene was chilling, but subtle inconsistencies suggested the attack might have been personal. Emily's car was still parked in the driveway, and there were no signs of forced entry. Although the front door was left ajar, the house itself was not ransacked. Nothing appeared to be stolen. The disturbed furniture suggested Emily had struggled with her attacker before being struck. Detective Thompson's attention was drawn to a broken picture frame on the floor near Emily's body. Inside was a photo of Emily with her ex-fiancé, Michael Davis. It was a small detail, but enough for the detective to wonder if Michael was connected to the crime further. Investigation revealed Emily had been engaged to Michael for nearly 2 years before breaking up. Several months earlier, the breakup was reportedly difficult for Emily, and many believed Michael had trouble moving on. Emily had started seeing someone new, though details of that relationship were kept private. Meanwhile, Michael was said to have shown up uninvited at places Emily frequented. Colleagues reported that Emily had become increasingly uneasy around Michael in the months before her death. Some described him as obsessive. Others noted he was polite but distant in public. Digging into Michael's background, Detective Thompson uncovered troubling signs. The 34-year-old accountant had recently lost his job after an internal audit revealed financial discrepancies. After his dismissal, Michael became reclusive and persistently contacted Emily, despite her pleas to stop. A search of Michael's home revealed disturbing evidence of his obsession. Several of Emily's personal belongings he had no right to possess. including a scarf left behind months earlier and a letter Emily had written to him during their engagement, a note expressing Michael's desire to reconcile and willingness to do anything to win Emily back. Was also found his journal entries, detailed feelings of betrayal and accusations that Emily had moved on too quickly. With this evidence, Michael became the prime suspect after hours of intense questioning. He confessed on the morning of January 15th. He had gone to Emily's house, hoping to convince her to give their relationship another chance. When rejected, he flew into a rage and attacked her with a heavy metal object, striking her multiple times. Emily's attempt to escape failed, and she was ultimately killed. Michael admitted that the murder was premeditated, fueled by entitlement and his belief that Emily owed him another chance. The community of Brentwood was left devastated. Emily Weston, a kind-hearted teacher who had touched so many lives, was gone because of a senseless act of violence. Michael Davis, once a familiar face in town, became a convicted murderer, shattering the lives of those who knew him. Friends, family, and colleagues mourned deeply, remembering Emily for her selflessness and dedication. Michael's trial was long and painful, but justice prevailed. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole over time. Brentwood began to heal. A scholarship in Emily's name was established at the local school, and her former students honored her memory through acts of kindness and dedication to learning. Though Emily's life was tragically cut short, her legacy lived on through those she inspired and the lessons she taught about compassion, resilience, and the preciousness of life for many in Brentwood. Emily's murder was a haunting reminder that darkness can lurk where least expected. It served as a stark warning about the dangers of obsession and the devastating consequences of unchecked anger and jealousy. Ultimately, Emily's death became a testament to life's fragility and the tragic outcomes when the human heart is consumed by rage and unrequited love. As the months passed, Brentwood, deeply affected by the loss of one of its brightest stars, continued. The town of Brentwood was left reeling from the loss of Emily Weston, a beloved teacher and active community member, creating a void that no one could fill. Her kindness had touched so many lives in the small town, and her brutal murder shattered the close-knit fabric that had held the community together. After Michael Davis's confession, life in Brentwood slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Yet the tragedy never fully left the minds of its residents. The story was still whispered about in coffee shops, and Emily's colleagues felt her absence deeply every day in the classroom. Many of her students, some close to graduation when she was killed, continued to honor her memory by excelling in their studies and demonstrating the same dedication she had always shown. The school district provided counseling to those most affected, helping them cope with their grief. But the shadow of that tragic morning lingered. One of the hardest truths for Emily's friends and family was the painful realization that her death might have been preventable. Many reflected on the months leading up to the murder and how Michael's obsession had escalated, unnoticed until it was too late. Despite Emily's firm but polite requests for him to respect her boundaries, Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. Friends recalled how he showed up uninvited at her home and left angry voicemails late at night. Emily had confided in a few close friends about her growing unease, but she had been reluctant to make a big deal of it, leaving those around her unaware of the depth of Michael's fixation. As Detective Thompson's investigation progressed, Michael's troubled history came to light. His recent financial troubles were a red flag, but deeper emotional instability had haunted him for years. Michael had been married once before, but his ex-wife left him after volatile disputes, including an incident of alleged physical aggression. She declined to comment when approached by police, but it was clear that Michael had long struggled with emotional issues. Psychological profile painted a disturbing picture. Michael had difficulty coping with rejection or failure, a trait that affected all areas of his life. The breakup with Emily triggered a downward spiral, not just a personal disappointment, but a blow to his ego. He couldn't accept his fixation on Emily, became a symbol of everything he had lost. growing into a dangerous obsession despite overwhelming evidence against him. The community struggled to comprehend how a man they had known could commit such a crime. Michael had always seemed polite and friendly, and many believed the breakup had been mutual and peaceful. Only after the murder did the extent of his emotional turmoil become apparent. Michael Davis's trial began in late summer 2002. Amid intense community attention, Emily's family and friends sat in the front rows. Their eyes fixed on the defendant. Michael appeared expressionless, occasionally glancing at the jurors but never meeting the gaze of those who had once known him. The defense argued that the murder was a crime of passion and impulsive act during a moment of overwhelming emotional distress. When Emily rejected him, they claimed he had not intended to kill her and could not fully understand the consequences of his actions at the time. However, the prosecution presented a firm case, showing Michael's behavior had been calculated and premeditated. They introduced text messages, phone records, and journal entries that revealed his deep obsession. Forensic evidence suggested the blunt force trauma was delivered with deliberate force, not the result of a fleeting outburst. The defense portrayed Michael as a man pushed beyond his limits by despair, but the jury was unconvinced after weeks of testimony and deliberation. Michael Davis was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The verdict brought mixed emotions to Brentwood. While many felt relief that justice was served, others grappled with disbelief. How could someone so integral to their community and Emily's fiancé commit such a horrific crime? The question lingered. Unresolved. Emily's funeral was a somber, heartfelt event. The community turned out in full force to honor her memory, but the void she left was undeniable. Her devastated family took comfort in knowing she had lived a life full of love and purpose. Her obituary, shared across the region, celebrated a woman dedicated to shaping young minds, marked by kindness, generosity, and deep community involvement. Emily's legacy, as her loved ones came to understand, was more than her professional accomplishments. It was the enduring lessons she imparted about kindness, compassion, and resilience, values that would live on in the hearts of all who knew her. The investigation and trial marked the close of a painful chapter in Brentwood's history, but the ripple effects persisted in the years that followed. The town increased awareness about domestic violence, and obsessive relationship support groups were created to assist those grappling with unhealthy emotional attachments, and schools began educating students on healthy relationships and how to recognize emotional manipulation. Though the tragedy remained a somber reminder of the dangers lurking beneath the surface, Brentwood worked to heal and prevent such heartbreak from happening again. Though they could never bring Emily back, the steps taken afterward were small, yet meaningful efforts to prevent such tragedies in the future. For Detective Sarah Thompson, the case stayed with her long after it had closed. Having seen countless murders during her career, Emily's death was uniquely haunting. It was committed by someone so close, someone who had once been a part of Emily's life. Yet Thompson found solace in the fact that justice had been served. Michael Davis was behind bars, paying for the life he had taken. Emily's memory lived on, not just in Brentwood, but in the hearts of all touched by her kindness and dedication. Months after Michael's conviction, Brentwood slowly settled back into routine, but the scars of Emily's loss ran deep. Though relieved that justice was done, residents struggled with disbelief. Emily's absence was felt every day in classrooms, community gatherings, and in quiet moments of reflection. The tragedy exposed the darker side of human nature, leaving many weary and questioning how well they truly knew those around them. Michael had been a familiar face to many, making the shock of his transformation all the more profound. Emily's parents took comfort in knowing Michael would never walk their town's streets again, but they would never fully heal from their loss. They buried their daughter with the same quiet dignity she had lived with, but often found themselves quietly mourning at her graveside, grappling with the painful question of why she was taken. There were no answers, no closure, only the harsh truth that the man who claimed to love her had stolen her life. Brentwood schools also bore the weight of Emily's death. Emily was more than a teacher. She was a mentor, a guide, a second mother to many students. News of her death sent shockwaves through the school community. With some students acting out and others withdrawing, the district responded by offering counseling to students and staff. And an anonymous hotline was established for those struggling to process their grief. Emily's classroom was eventually transformed into a memorial, with photos, notes, and mementos from her students decorating the walls, preserving her legacy in the space that had once been filled with laughter and learning students. One young girl named Sarah found particular comfort in the memorial, a dedicated pupil, always eager to learn and help others. Sarah was devastated by the loss, but resolved to carry on Emily's work. She started an after-school tutoring program for struggling students, which eventually grew into a central part of Brentwood's educational efforts. Living tribute to Emily's spirit as the community coped. Emily's legacy endured through those she had touched. Brentwood became more open in discussing relationships, mental health, and the signs of unhealthy attachments. Her death forced the town to confront uncomfortable realities many had ignored, such as the dangers of obsession and emotional abuse. Detective Thompson, meanwhile, remained haunted by the case. She had handled hundreds of investigations, but Emily's murder lingered in her thoughts. The blood-stained living room, the broken picture frame images, she couldn't forget more than any other case. It felt personal. She questioned whether warning signs in Michael's behavior had been missed. Even by those closest to him, she knew his obsession had grown gradually, but no one realized its depth until it was tragically too late. Thompson had seen domestic violence cases before, but this one felt different. It left her with an unshakable guilt and hard questions. Could Emily's death have been prevented? Had the signs been overlooked? Determined to find answers, she dedicated herself to researching patterns of obsessive behavior and revisiting cases that might have been neglected. She collaborated with local organizations advocating mental health awareness and domestic violence prevention. Over the following years, Brentwood experienced a steady rise in public education and community programs designed to identify and address unhealthy emotional attachments. Thompson led workshops teaching about emotional manipulation, controlling behavior, and how to establish healthy relationship boundaries. Though these efforts were just one part of a broader healing process, they became vital to Brentwood's recovery. Town leaders recognized that Emily's death forced them to face uncomfortable truths about human relationships, and they committed to ensuring no other family would endure a similar loss. Despite Michael Davis's life sentence, questions about his case lingered. Was he truly a danger to society, or a man who had lost control? Emily's family would never know the answer. They could not tell if Michael's remorse was genuine or motivated by a desire to avoid the death penalty for them. There was no closure, only the unbearable reality that their daughter's life was stolen in the most violent, senseless way. The case continued to be studied in academic circles and law enforcement agencies nationwide, serving as a solemn reminder of the devastating consequences when obsession and rage go unchecked. Experts in criminal psychology and domestic violence debated whether the legal system had done enough to address the complex issues of emotional manipulation, obsession, and relationship-based violence. Michael Davis's case was frequently cited as a stark example of how obsessive behavior can escalate into dangerous fate, even deadly outcomes. At the same time, it raised important questions about how society might better recognize and respond to warning signs before tragedy strikes. Though Emily Weston's murder became a painful chapter in Brentwood's history, it also served as a catalyst for change. In the years following the case, the town began to heal. While it was never quite the same, Brentwood grew stronger and more resilient. It learned from its past and was determined to ensure that the tragedy of Emily's death would not be forgotten. For those who had known Emily, her spirit lived on through the kindness and compassion they showed each other. She had been a teacher, a mentor, and a friend, and ultimately, it was her students, colleagues, and community who carried on her legacy, teaching others to care, to listen, and to love without reservation, though Michael Davis would remain imprisoned for life. Emily's impact on Brentwood would never fade. She had demonstrated that kindness could heal, even amid unimaginable pain, leaving an enduring mark on everyone who knew Heron, the quiet, snow-covered streets of Springfield. January 2002 began with a chilling discovery that would haunt the town for years. The day started like any other, with winter frost forming on windows and distant traffic muffled beneath a fresh blanket of snow. But early that morning, the town's calm was shattered. A neighbor called the local police to report a murder. The victim was Allison Hayes, a prominent businesswoman known for both her success and philanthropy, a devoted mother of two and wife. Allison appeared to have it all. Her company, Hayes Enterprises, had flourished over the past decade, making her one of the wealthiest and most influential residents in the area. Police arrived at Allison's upscale home on the town's outskirts following a 6:45 a.m. call from a neighbor who had witnessed Allison's husband, Thomas Hayes, pacing nervously outside. The neighbor described Thomas as disheveled and panicked, repeatedly knocking and shouting for help when no one answered after several failed attempts. Thomas forced open the door, only to find Allison's lifeless body in the kitchen, lying in a pool of blood. The scene was brutal. A single gunshot wound to the chest, and clear signs of a struggle. Thomas immediately called 911. Detective Robert Hazenall, relation to the victim, was assigned the case upon entering the home. He was struck by the confusion of the scene. Allison's death was swift and fatal, and there were no signs of forced entry, suggesting the killer was likely someone she knew. The evidence of a struggle indicated Allison had tried to defend herself. Visibly distraught, was quickly questioned. He said he had returned from a business trip the previous night, around 9 p.m. The two had briefly discussed plans for the weekend before going to bed. Thomas insisted nothing seemed unusual and denied any reason for someone to harm Allison, yet Detective Hayes noticed inconsistencies. Thomas's behavior appeared rehearsed. His answers were quick, but lacking detail. He avoided direct eye contact and fixated unusually on the specifics of Allison's death, repeatedly asking how she was found and what had caused it. These behaviors raised suspicions as the investigation unfolded. Detective Hayes delved into the couple's lives and discovered a troubled marriage. Thomas had portrayed himself as a devoted husband, but interviews with friends, family, and colleagues told a different story. Rumors surfaced of an affair between Thomas and a younger woman named Laura Blackwell, a secretary at one of his company's branches. Laura admitted to a 6-month romantic relationship with Thomas, but claimed it had ended weeks earlier, and that she had no involvement in the couple's marital problems. However, further investigation revealed deeper secrets. Financial records showed Thomas had been embezzling money from Hayes Enterprises for months, funneling large sums into offshore accounts under false names. He used these funds to support his lavish lifestyle and maintain his relationship with Laura. Listen had grown suspicious of Thomas's behavior after realizing their financial stability was not as solid as he had claimed, according to close friends. Allison confided her devastation and was considering divorce, though no final decision had been made. Faced with the prospect of losing everything, the family business, their home, and the life they had built, Thomas's greed and desperation seemed to have pushed him toward a terrible choice. Detective Hayes uncovered more damning evidence during a search of the Hayes home, including a hidden safe in the basement containing documents detailing Thomas's illicit activities. Among them was a letter from a law firm, dated just days before Allison's death, confirming that she had hired them to begin divorce proceedings. The motive became clear. Fearing the loss of his wealth and secret affair, Thomas may have resorted to murder. Fearing the loss of his wealth and the collapse of the life he had meticulously built, Thomas Hayes took drastic action in the early hours of the morning. When Allison was alone and vulnerable, he shot her in cold blood. The struggle in the kitchen was Allison's desperate attempt to defend herself, but she was caught off guard by her husband's betrayal. and her life was violently ended in that terrifying moment as evidence against Thomas mounted. Law enforcement acted swiftly on the night of January 23, 2002, just days after the murder. Thomas Hayes was arrested at his home. The community was stunned by the arrest. Friends and family, who once saw him as a successful, respectable man, struggled to comprehend the truth. Springfield was shaken to its core by the realization that the killer was someone they all knew and trusted. In the days leading up to the trial, Thomas's defense team argued that the shooting had been accidental. They claimed he was overwhelmed by emotional turmoil, citing his financial difficulties and marital stress as mitigating circumstances, but the prosecution remained firm, portraying Thomas as a man consumed by greed, jealousy, and fear of losing everything he had worked for. The calculated and cold manner in which the murder was carried out left no doubt in the jury's mind. After a highly publicized trial in late spring 2002, Thomas Hayes was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The verdict brought some measure of closure to Allison's loved ones, but Springfield's sense of safety was deeply shaken. The murder of a prominent businesswoman by her own husband fractured the community's trust in those they once believed were safe. For Allison's children, Emily and Ryan, both teenagers at the time, the loss was devastating. Allison had been a devoted mother, always present at school events, helping with homework, and encouraging her children's dreams. Without her, they were adrift in grief and confusion. Emily, then a high school senior, was forced to mature quickly, taking on responsibilities far beyond her years. Ryan, just a year younger, struggled to come to terms with the betrayal of his father. Though Thomas had been arrested, the hardest wound was the emotional betrayal. The father they once admired was now a cold-blooded murderer. The emotional toll deepened as the family coped with the shock. Emily felt isolated despite support from friends and relatives. She found it difficult to share her pain and sought solace in solitary walks by the river and quiet hours spent sorting through family photos. Ryan's response was anger. His volatile nature was exacerbated by his father's actions. He lashed out at classmates and even at those trying to comfort him. His raw anger worried those close to him, fearing he might spiral down a dangerous path in the wake of their loss. Emily and Ryan chose very different paths, encouraged by her mother's friends and a compassionate school counselor. Emily channeled her grief into a positive force. She pursued social work, determined to help other children affected by trauma and loss, volunteering with local organizations supporting survivors of domestic violence. She became a passionate advocate for children in crisis, finding purpose and healing in her work. Ryan, however, took a darker road. His anger and feelings of betrayal festered over time. Despite efforts to keep him grounded, he rebelled, dropping out of school and getting into trouble with the law. Substance abuse and heavy drinking became his way of numbing the pain. Despite his mother's attempts to intervene, the once close family was irreparably broken. The investigation into Thomas Hayes was exhaustive, leaving no detail unexplored. His trial attracted intense media attention. Both locally and nationally, the case stood as a stark warning about the destructive power of greed and the emotional toll financial stress can impose. But for those who had known Thomas, disbelief lingered. How could a man they trusted commit such a horrific crime? Despite his conviction, disbelief lingered in Springfield. Thomas Hayes had been a respected businessman and a pillar of the community. No one expected him capable of such a horrific act. In the years after the trial, residents struggled to come to terms with the fact that they had lived alongside a murderer without suspecting a thing. The revelation of Thomas's affair with Laura Blackwell shocked many, but the uncovering of his embezzlement was even more staggering. His business empire crumbled, revealing a man leading a double life. The stolen funds supported his lavish lifestyle, yet it was never enough to satisfy his deeper hunger for control and power. The real issue wasn't money, but his sense of entitlement, the belief he could act without consequences. The public attention faded. Springfield focused on rebuilding, but the memory of the tragedy remained. The murder left an indelible scar. forcing the community to confront unsettling truths about darkness hidden beneath ordinary lives. Emily and Ryan, now adults, each found their own path to healing. Emily's work in social services gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Though the pain of losing her mother never fully left her, she often reflected on what might have been. Had her father not taken her mother away, staying close to her mother's friends brought her comfort. But the shadow of the murder always influenced her views on trust and relationships. Now, in his late 20s, has made strides in overcoming his troubled past. After several stints in rehab, he found steady work in construction and, with counseling, learned healthier ways to manage his anger. Yet the questions, why did his father do it? What drove him to murder the woman he once vowed to love? Still haunted him. These mysteries remained unanswered, a persistent weight in his mind. Springfield, meanwhile, worked hard to move forward. Thomas's businesses were sold off, and the foundation, established in Allison's name, grew, providing support to countless women escaping domestic abuse. But for those who knew the Hayes family, the question lingered: how could such a brutal crime happen so close to home? Though justice was served and Thomas locked away for life, Springfield was forever changed. Residents learned a painful lesson: behind even the most perfect facades can lurk deception and violence. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. The consequences of one person's actions echoed across the entire community over time. The quiet streets returned to their usual rhythm, but Allison Hayes' murder remained etched in collective memory. The case became a cautionary tale for Springfield, affecting not only her immediate family but the entire town, leaving behind a legacy of grief and distrust. The trial itself was intense and emotional. The courtroom was filled with Springfield residents as both sides presented their cases. Thomas's defense portrayed him as overwhelmed by financial woes and a failing marriage, appealing for sympathy and framing the murder as a breakdown under extreme stress. But the prosecution's case was undeniable. They brought forward detailed evidence, embezzlement records, the divorce letter, and damning witness pointing to premeditation. Thomas Hayes had deliberately chosen to end his wife's life to protect his wealth and reputation. After days of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. As the verdict was read, Emily and Ryan sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by emotion. For them, the moment was bittersweet. While it offered closure, it also marked the start of a painful journey, one in which their lives had been forever changed, and they would need to rebuild from the ruins left behind. The trial was just the beginning of a long healing process both siblings struggled with. The emotional aftermath. In their own ways, Emily devoted herself to honoring her mother's memory through volunteer work with domestic violence organizations, raising awareness about financial abuse and toxic relationships. This gave her purpose, but never erased the pain. Every success reminded her of the betrayal that shattered her family. Ryan grappled with anger and confusion, despite attempts to repair his relationship with his mother. Bitterness lingered. He saw her as weak for allowing their father's darkness to shape their lives. His anger eventually turned inward, contributing to struggles with addiction and a strained bond with his mother, though he wished not to follow his father's path. Ryan sometimes felt trapped in a cycle of self-destructive behavior that echoed the past for Thomas Hayes. Life behind bars was far from easy. Prison was a constant reminder of his crime, stripping away the wealth and status he once wielded. Once a respected and influential businessman admired by the people of Springfield, Thomas Hayes now spent his days confined in a prison cell, far removed from the life he had built. The betrayal of his family, especially his children, weighed heavily on him. He had lost everything: his company, wealth, reputation, and most painfully, the trust of his family. His relationship with Emily and Ryan was fractured beyond repair, and he understood that no amount of remorse could ever undo the irreversible damage he had caused. Prison life brought harsh realities for Thomas due to the nature of his crime. He was frequently isolated from the general inmate population. Among fellow prisoners, he was scorned as a coward who had murdered his own wife, Whispers about his crime followed him relentlessly, and the admiration once afforded to him for his business acumen was replaced with disdain alone. Thomas spent much of his time reflecting on the choices that led to that irreversible, dark moment in the silence of his cell. He came to understand that his actions had not only taken his wife's life, but had shattered his children's futures lives. He could never repair the ripple effects of Allison's murder, extended far beyond Thomas's conviction. The tragedy sparked vital conversations in Springfield about domestic violence, the pressure to maintain appearances, and the hidden struggles many families endure behind closed doors. For many, it was a wake-up call. Even the most seemingly perfect families can harbor terrible secrets. The Hayes family story became a sobering lesson on the dangers of unchecked ambition, the corrosive nature of greed, and the tragic consequences of betrayal in the aftermath. Springfield saw a surge in community-driven efforts to support survivors of domestic violence and financial abuse, inspired by Allison's commitment to helping others. Several local organizations established foundations in her honor to aid women facing precarious situations. Similarly, as a leading figure in her mother's foundation, tirelessly raised awareness about financial abuse and worked to provide resources to those in need. Though her mother's death left a wound that could never fully heal, Emily found comfort in knowing that Allison's legacy lived on through the countless lives she had touched. Ryan's path to healing was long and arduous, marked by setbacks and moments of doubt. With therapy and the support of close friends, he gradually confronted the trauma he had endured. He began to process his anger and resentment, coming to terms with the fact that the father he once admired was not the man he thought he knew. Slowly, Ryan made peace with his past, rebuilt relationships with family members, and took tentative steps toward forgiveness. Thomas Hayes' crime destroyed more than just his wife's life, shattered the foundations of everyone who had once depended on him. Yet, over the years, those most affected began the difficult work of reclaiming their lives. Emily and Ryan refused to let the darkness of their past define their futures. The town of Springfield, too, began to heal while the scars of the murder lingered. The community gradually rebuilt itself, fostering a safer and more compassionate environment. What once tore the town apart now served as a reminder that even amidst overwhelming darkness, hope for redemption and recovery remained. Story 7. The icy January winds of 2002 swept through the small town of Pinehurst, a place known for its quiet streets and close-knit community. The residents were unprepared for the horror that would unfold that winter morning, a crime that would shatter their sense of safety and force them to confront a grim reality. On the morning of January 15th, at approximately 7:45 a.m., local police received a frantic call. The voice on the other end was Margaret Blackwell, wife of George Blackwell, a well-known businessman and philanthropist in Pinehurst. Trembling and hysterical, Margaret described the grisly scene she had discovered in their family home. He's dead. I found him in the study. There's so much blood, she cried. Her voice shaking. Officers were immediately dispatched to the Blackwell residence on Elm Street. The family had long been respected for their generosity and community involvement. George had built a fortune in real estate, while Margaret had shared his philanthropic passions, admired for her grace and elegance. Upon arrival, the police were met with a chilling sight. George Blackwell's lifeless body was slumped in a chair in the study of their grand home. His face was battered, and a large pool of blood surrounded him. The violence was evident. He had suffered multiple blows to the head, consistent with blunt force trauma. His once pristine clothing was soaked in blood, and his eyes were wide open in a frozen expression of shock and terror. Detective David Walker, a seasoned investigator with the Pinehurst Police Department, was assigned to the case. As he began a meticulous search of the house, he found the rest of the Blackwell family absent. Children Daniel and Sarah were at school, while Margaret remained in the living room. Overwhelmed by shock and unable to provide much information, Margaret told officers she had found her husband early that morning when she went to bring him coffee. There were no signs of forced entry, which struck Walker as suspicious for someone to enter the house and commit such a violent crime without leaving a trace was unusual. The study, located toward the back of the large home, was a secluded area. As Walker examined the rooms, his mind churned with questions. Who could have committed this brutal attack, and why? Margaret was taken in for questioning, but Margaret appeared too distraught to provide any meaningful information, visibly shaken. She struggled to recall anything useful about her husband's life in the days before the murder. When asked if George had any enemies or anyone who might have wanted to harm him, Margaret insisted that he was well liked by everyone and had no known adversaries. Detective Walker, however, remained skeptical. George Blackwell was a successful businessman, and Walker knew that ambition at such a level often came with enemies. Determined to uncover the truth, he began digging into George's business dealings, searching for clues that might explain why someone would want him dead. As the investigation progressed over the next few days, troubling details emerged. George had been involved in several high-stakes real estate deals that had recently soured. Most notably, he was at the center of a controversial downtown redevelopment project, which involved demolishing several older buildings. This plan faced significant opposition from the community and business owners whose properties were at risk. Among the most vocal critics was Daniel Rizzo, a local businessman whose building was slated for demolition. Rizzo had openly accused George of disregarding the historical value of the buildings and showing little concern for small business owners. His protests had even escalated to threats. Though he had never been formally linked to any violence, nevertheless, his animosity toward George was well known, and Walker took careful note. Walker's investigation included interviews with those who knew George. While some spoke of him as a charitable man with a strong community spirit, others painted a more ruthless picture, describing a businessman willing to use underhanded tactics and prioritize his own gain at the expense of others. A breakthrough came when Walker's team obtained phone records revealing a series of calls George had made to an unknown number days before his death. The calls were brief, but enough to raise suspicion. The number was traced back to Daniel Rizzo, was brought in for questioning. He denied any involvement in George's murder, but as evidence mounted, the pressure intensified. Walker uncovered that George had threatened to expose Rizzo's precarious financial situation to force him into agreeing to the demolition project. For Rizzo, losing his building would have been disastrous. Under confrontation, Rizzo eventually confessed. He admitted to going to George's home on the morning of January 15th, intending only to confront him about the project, but a heated argument erupted, and in a moment of blind rage, Rizzo struck George multiple times, delivering the fatal blows. What began as a confrontation turned into a crime of passion, an eruption of months of frustration and pressure. Rizzo was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The town of Pinehurst was left reeling as the truth surfaced. A business dispute had escalated into a deadly crime. The community grappled with the sobering realization of how ambition and greed could push someone to such extremes. The Blackwell family, already devastated by the loss, now faced the harsh truth behind George's life, truth that would haunt them for years. The trial that followed captivated the town, as residents sought answers to how a respected businessman could meet such a tragic end. For Margaret and the children, the courtroom proceedings were an agonizing ordeal. While they learned that George's business dealings were far from flawless, hearing the full scope of his actions from the witness stand was difficult to bear. Margaret sat quietly in the front row, her hands tightly clasped, visibly diminished by recent events. She had never imagined that the man she loved and trusted could be entangled in so much conflict, or that their life together was steeped in deception. Daniel Rizzo's testimony confirmed her worst fears. George's legacy was not one of philanthropy, but of ruthless ambition and self-interest. The prosecution presented a strong case, highlighting the phone records, the contentious relationship, and the evidence of coercion George exerted over Rizzo. The defense argued that Rizzo had no intention to kill, but had acted in a moment of overwhelming emotional distress. caused by George's relentless pressures. The trial progressed. More details emerged about the power struggle between the two men. The prosecution emphasized that George's threats to expose Rizzo's financial instability pushed him to the breaking point, leading to the tragic murder. Daniel Rizzo's defense claimed that he had not intended to kill George Blackwell, but acted in a moment of overwhelming emotional turmoil. According to Rizzo's testimony, the confrontation had turned violent after George allegedly became belligerent and threatened to ruin his life. Although his account was inconsistent at times, the raw emotion in his voice was undeniable. It appeared that, driven by a mix of anger and fear, Rizzo never fully anticipated that the confrontation would end in murder, despite the defense's efforts to characterize the killing as a crime of passion. The evidence suggested otherwise. Witnesses reported Rizzo's increasingly erratic behavior in the days before the murder. He had been seen repeatedly visiting George's business offices, attempting to negotiate and press his demands. In the days leading up to the crime, Rizzo was struggling to keep his business afloat, overwhelmed by mounting debts threatening to ruin him. When he finally snapped, it was clear that his long-simmering rage had reached a breaking point. Rizzo's legal team portrayed him as a man driven to desperation by the ruthless tactics of a powerful businessman. They pointed to his troubled past and financial hardships, arguing that he was a victim of circumstance, who lost control under immense pressure. However, after several hours of deliberation, the jury rejected this defense. They recognized that while Rizzo's actions were fueled by intense personal and professional frustration, he had made a deliberate choice to use violence. He had taken the life of a once prominent town figure to end their conflict permanently. The verdict offered some relief to the community, though it did little to heal the wounds. Daniel Rizzo was found guilty of second-degree murder, a charge acknowledging both the emotional nature of his actions and the lack of premeditation. The jury could not reach a unanimous decision on first-degree murder, but agreed that Rizzo's violence was driven by passion and desperation. Rizzo was sentenced to 25 years in prison, though some considered the sentence harsh, given his emotional state. Many saw it as justified, due to the brutal nature of the crime. For the Blackwell family, the sentence brought little comfort. Margaret and her children faced the grim reality that George's death was not random violence, but the outcome of choices made by the man they once trusted. They had to confront the painful truth that George's ambition and relentless drive had strained even his closest relationships. Beyond repairing the weeks following the trial, Pinehurst began its slow healing process. The murder had shaken the community to its core and prompted many to reflect on their values and priorities. Though George Blackwell's reputation as a businessman was tarnished, his death ignited a conversation about the extremes people would go to protect their financial interests, and status. Open discussions about pressures faced by residents helped restore a sense of community that had felt fractured. Despite her grief, Margaret found new purpose. She became an advocate for victims of financial abuse, partnering with local charities to raise awareness about the hidden toll of economic manipulation on families. Her work offered a way to channel her loss into something positive, hoping to prevent others from enduring similar pain. The Blackwell children also worked to rebuild their lives. Though the road was difficult, Sarah, deeply affected by her father's death, focused on her studies and pursued a career in social work to support others coping with trauma and loss. Daniel wrestled with anger and confusion for years, carrying the heavy burden of his father's actions through counseling. He gradually found ways to process his pain, but the scars remained. Meanwhile, Daniel Rizzo's prison time was a stark reminder of the consequences of his choices. Although therapy and rehabilitation brought some peace, he lived with the lifelong guilt of taking George Blackwell's life. The murder of George Blackwell in January 2002 cast a long shadow over Pinehurst. It was a tragedy that forced the town to confront uncomfortable realities about ambition, greed, and human capacity for violence. As Pinehurst moved forward, the memory of George, a man once loved, but ultimately undone by his own Ruthless pursuits remained a cautionary tale. The community, though scarred, began to heal, reflecting on the complex interplay of power, desperation, and consequences beneath its quiet suburban surface. Many residents reconsidered their perceptions of George Blackwell. Once viewed as a benefactor, he was now seen as driven by an insatiable thirst for wealth and control. His charitable deeds were reinterpreted by some as calculated efforts to polish his public image, rather than genuine altruism. Despite the changes, the Blackwell family remained a pillar in Pinehurst's social fabric. Margaret, forever transformed by the events of January 2002, continued to be a powerful advocate in the community, dedicated to turning tragedy into hope. Margaret Blackwell became a respected figure in the community, transforming her personal tragedy into a powerful platform for advocacy. She spoke out for those who had suffered financial exploitation and abuse, drawing from her own painful experience with the dangers of wealth and power when wielded irresponsibly. Determined to prevent others from enduring similar hardships, Margaret made it her mission to raise awareness and support victims. Her efforts garnered support from many in Pinehurst, including some of George Blackwell's former associates, those who had once admired George and later learned the truth about his dealings, expressed deep remorse, and actively supported Margaret's cause. Others remained silent, burdened by guilt over their complicity in George's actions. But for Margaret, the journey was never about gaining validation from others. It was about healing. Though the pain of losing her husband never fully faded, her work gave her purpose and hope. Sarah Blackwell eventually left Pinehurst to attend college and pursue a career in social work. Although the loss of her father stayed with her, she found comfort in helping others facing trauma. Motivated by her own experience and the revelations about her father's life, Sarah became an advocate for mental health awareness. She focused on supporting survivors of abuse, whether financial, emotional, or physical, and providing resources for rebuilding lives. Daniel Blackwell, George's son, struggled more deeply with the aftermath. Distant from his father even before the tragedy, Daniel was forced to confront complex emotions of grief, anger, and confusion. At first, he channeled his pain into anger, questioning why his father had been taken and why his father's actions had led to such a devastating end. Over time, however, he found ways to cope. He dedicated himself to volunteering for at-risk youth and conflict resolution programs, hoping to help others avoid the mistakes that ensnared his father. Through this work, Daniel sought forgiveness for both his father and himself. For Daniel Rizzo, life in prison became both punishment and a form of self-imposed penance. He carried a deep remorse for killing George Blackwell, though no sentence could undo the damage. Once a successful businessman himself, Rizzo's life unraveled after the murder in prison. He spent much time reflecting on the choices that led to that fatal moment. He attended therapy, anger management, and rehabilitation programs, determined to change. Yet he understood that no transformation could bring George back or heal the Blackwell family's pain. With time, Rizzo became quieter. The rage that once consumed him replaced by sorrow and acceptance. He recognized that the man he had been before the murder was gone, replaced by someone forced to face the consequences of his actions, driven by desperation. He had chosen violence, and now he lived with the weight of that irreversible choice. For the Blackwell family, life would never be the same. They were forced to reconcile the public image of George Blackwell with the private reality revealed by his death. George had been a man of contradictions, benevolent to some, ruthless and manipulative to others. His murder exposed the complexity of his character and left his family navigating a new world shaped by grief and uncertainty. Murder served as a stark reminder to Pinehurst of the hidden darkness behind seemingly perfect facades. It illustrated how ambition and power could destroy lives, not only those of victims, but also of perpetrators. Though the town slowly healed, the memory of the Blackwell murder lingered. It became a chapter in Pinehurst's history that highlighted the tension between outward success and inner turmoil, ambition and integrity. Pinehurst had been irrevocably changed, but its residents learned valuable lessons. No one, no matter how successful or admired, was immune to life's pressures. And the choices people make can have far-reaching consequences. The legacies of George Blackwell and Daniel Rizzo would never be forgotten. The Axtown would remember the tragedy of January 2002, while striving to balance ambition with kindness and success with morality. Story 8. On a bitter January evening in 2002, the city of Brooklyn, New York, was shaken by the shocking murder of a prominent community figure, Vincent Harris, a local businessman known for his charitable work and vast real estate connections. His death would unravel a tangled web of deceit, betrayal, and long-buried secrets that left the city reeling for months. Vincent Harris was a self-made millionaire who rose from humble beginnings in Queens through relentless hard work, sharp business instincts, and the ability to forge powerful alliances despite his success. He had made many enemies. Business rivals left financially ruined, and those who resented his ruthless negotiating style. Still, Vincent managed to maintain a public image as a philanthropist, donating generously to youth programs and establishing scholarships for underprivileged students for most of Brooklyn. Vincent was a respected figure, wealthy, influential, and seemingly unstoppable. But on the evening of January 15, 2002, everything changed. Vincent's assistant, Claire Thompson, arrived at his apartment around 7:00 p.m. for a scheduled meeting. When she opened the office door, she was met with a scene of horror. Vincent was slumped over his desk, lifeless, with a gunshot wound to the back of his head. The spacious room, adorned with expensive furniture and artwork, showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. Claire immediately called 911. But by the time police arrived, it was too late. Detective Michael Carter, a seasoned investigator with the Brooklyn Police Department, was assigned to the case. Though experienced with violent crimes, Carter found Vincent Harris's death unusual. The clean, execution-style killing, with no apparent forced entry or robbery, suggested a targeted murder given Vincent's wide network and influence. Carter knew the case could have significant implications for the community. The investigation began in the usual way, interviewing family, friends, and colleagues. Vincent's estranged wife, Amanda Harris, was the first to be questioned. The couple had been separated for nearly 2 years after a bitter divorce. Despite their troubled past, Amanda was visibly shaken by Vincent's death. She insisted that their relationship had ended long ago and claimed no knowledge of anyone who might want to harm him. There were no reports of threats, and she hadn't seen Vincent in weeks. However, Vincent's business associates painted a different picture. They described him as a man who had made many enemies, especially in the competitive world of real estate. Over the years, Vincent had aggressively acquired properties, often outbidding smaller developers or using tough tactics to control lucrative deals. One particularly bitter dispute was with Richard Carmichael, a rival developer and former business partner. Their fallout stemmed from a failed luxury residential project in downtown Brooklyn, which had caused significant financial losses for Carmichael. Detective Carter focused his attention on Carmichael, known for his grudges and underhanded methods. Yet, despite suspicions, Carmichael had an alibi for the night of the murder, and his lawyer firmly denied any motive. Still, Carter sensed there was more beneath the surface. As the investigation unfolded, it took a personal turn when Claire Thompson, who had discovered Vincent's body, became a person of interest. She was one of the few close to Vincent in recent months, and her presence at the crime scene raised questions. Claire, in her late 20s, had worked for Vincent for over 3 years and was known for being efficient, loyal, and discreet. However, during questioning, she appeared nervous and evasive. Claire claimed she had been working late when she found Vincent and that she hadn't seen anyone else in the building that evening. But a deeper dive into her background revealed surprising details. Claire had once been involved in a brief relationship with Vincent, something she hadn't disclosed initially. The relationship ended badly after Vincent discovered she had been seeing another man, simultaneously known for his vindictive nature in personal matters. Vincent's rejection had left Claire devastated. She had even filed a restraining order against him for a short time. Further investigation uncovered that Claire was deeply in debt and struggling with gambling problems in the months leading up to Vincent's murder. She had frequented high-stakes poker games, hoping to recover lost money, but her debts kept mounting. Her financial troubles were a closely guarded secret. Piecing together the evidence, Carter uncovered a chilling motive. Claire had gone to Vincent's apartment under the pretense of discussing work, but intended to rob him, knowing he kept large amounts of cash in his safe. When Vincent refused to give her money, the confrontation turned violent. In a fit of rage, Claire shot him and staged the scene to mimic a professional hither. Plan quickly unraveled when surveillance footage showed her leaving the building minutes after the shooting with mounting evidence. Claire was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During the trial, the prosecution argued that Claire had carefully planned the murder to escape her financial problems. The defense, however, claimed the shooting was a crime of passion, a tragic result of a heated argument that spiraled out of control. Ultimately, the jury rejected the defense's claim and found Claire Thompson guilty of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Vincent Harris's murder sent shockwaves through Brooklyn. The tragedy exposed the dark side of a seemingly perfect life. His reputation as a philanthropist and businessman was forever marred by the revelations of his complicated relationships and the enemies he had made. The case also served as a stark reminder of how desperation and hidden secrets can drive people to commit terrible acts. For Claire Thompson, her life was irrevocably changed. Once a loyal assistant, she now faced a lifetime behind bars, paying the price for her fatal actions. In the months that followed, Brooklyn struggled to come to terms with the murder. As details emerged, the community learned more about Vincent's ruthless business tactics and the complex web of relationships around him. Claire's involvement stunned many, as she had been viewed as a quiet, professional assistant, someone no one would have suspected. The media frenzy surrounding Claire Thompson's trial quickly intensified, turning the case into a spectacle that drew crowds from Brooklyn and beyond. The story of betrayal, financial desperation, and a seemingly perfect life unraveling into tragedy captivated the public. Once a timid assistant, Claire was now thrust into the harsh spotlight, becoming a symbol of the devastating consequences of hidden debts and emotional turmoil. As the prosecution laid out its case, Claire's dark motives became increasingly clear. Witnesses detailed her mounting financial troubles, revealing a spiral of gambling debts and loans from shady lenders that had trapped her in a cycle she couldn't escape. Her former boyfriend, a key figure in her turbulent personal life, took the stand, describing Claire's growing obsession with money and her deteriorating emotional state. The image of a once diligent and dependable employee dissolved, replaced by that of a woman willing to kill to solve her financial woes. The prosecution painted a portrait not only of Claire's gambling addiction, but also of her desperate need to maintain a facade of success. Vincent had reportedly grown wary of her behavior, confiding in close colleagues about his suspicions that Claire was hiding something. Yet no one could have foreseen that the assistant so close to Vincent would ultimately betray him in the most brutal way. Meanwhile, the defense sought to portray Claire as a victim, caught in the grip of overwhelming financial and emotional distress. They argued the murder was a crime of passion, an impulsive act during a heated argument. When Claire's desperate pleas for money were rejected, their goal was to cast doubt on whether Claire had premeditated the killing, seeking to reduce her culpability. Forensic evidence and the prosecution's case undermined these claims. The crime scene analysis showed Vincent's death was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but a deliberate, targeted execution. Claire had shot him once in the back of the head, with no sign of a struggle, and had meticulously staged the scene to resemble a professional hit. Surveillance footage confirmed her movements after the murder, erasing any doubt about her calculated planning. As the trial neared its end, the gravity of Claire's actions weighed heavily on everyone involved. Vincent's family, who had once supported Claire as part of their inner circle, were devastated by the betrayal. Michael Harris, Vincent's brother, gave a heartbreaking testimony, expressing the deep pain of losing a sibling and the crushing sense of betrayal by someone they had trusted like family. Despite the emotional weight of the trial, the jury reached their verdict. Claire Thompson was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, in his sentencing, emphasized the cold and calculated nature of the crime, showing no leniency for her financial struggles. He underscored the tragic loss of an innocent life at her hands. Claire's defense team immediately filed an appeal, claiming a miscarriage of justice, but the community's response was clear. Justice had been served in the aftermath. The case continued to haunt Brooklyn. Vincent Harris's murder exposed the dark realities that can hide behind a veneer of success, reminding residents that wealth and status often mask desperation and personal demons for many. It was a sobering reminder that even the seemingly untouchable can be driven to dangerous extremes. The Harris family, though comforted by the verdict, could not undo the emotional wounds left by the tragedy. Vincent's children were forced to reconcile with the loss of their father at the hands of someone they had trusted implicitly. This painful reality cast a long shadow over their lives. The murder also sparked broader conversations within the community about the pressures of success and the lengths people might go to protect their status and wealth. Brooklyn grappled with the unsettling truth that beneath the surface of prosperity can lie greed, desperation, and betrayal. For Claire Thompson, the consequences were lifelong sentence to life without parole. She faced the harsh reality of her actions from within prison walls, once full of promise. She became another cautionary tale swallowed by the criminal justice system. The money she had sought to claim through murder slipped forever from her grasp. She lost everything: her freedom, reputation, and the trust of those who had once depended on her. Behind the cold steel bars of her cell, Claire would have ample time to reflect on the choices that led to this tragic outcome. Though nothing could undo the irreversible damage she had caused, Vincent Harris's murder was a tragedy not just for his family, but for the entire community that had once revered him. And while Brooklyn would eventually move forward, the echoes of that dark night and its aftermath would linger for years to come. The story of Claire Thompson's involvement in Vincent Harris's murder did not end with her conviction. In the years that followed, public interest in the case persisted, and the ripple effects of the tragedy continued to unfold in unexpected ways. Though Vincent's family found some closure with Claire's conviction, they remained deeply haunted by their loss. Michael Harris, Vincent's older brother, and a heartfelt speaker during the trial, struggled to come to terms with the reality of Vincent's death. The family's grief was further compounded by the profound betrayal of someone they had once trusted and embraced as part of their lives. Vincent's children, still teenagers when the murder occurred, grew up living in the shadow of their father's tragic end. Though they tried to move forward, the legacy of his death lingered heavily in interviews. They openly discussed the void left by his absence, coupled with a deep-seated anger toward the woman who had taken him from them. The media frenzy surrounding the case never fully subsided over the years. Countless articles, documentaries, and podcasts delved into Claire's motives and Vincent's complicated life. The case became emblematic of the darker side of ambitions, the pressures to succeed, the hunger for wealth, and the ruthless willingness to betray even those closest to you, sometimes with devastating consequences. Vincent Harris had been a man marked by business triumphs, public admiration, and charitable acts. Yet beneath the surface, his life was riddled with ruthless business tactics and strained personal relationships. These revelations only deepened the public's fascination with his story, making it difficult for anyone to forget the tragedy. Claire Thompson's life behind bars was no easier than her trial had been following her conviction. She spent the initial years of her sentence in solitary confinement, a measure designed to protect her from other inmates who viewed her as a high-profile prisoner, seen as a pariah. Claire's crime was regarded as especially heinous due to the brutal betrayal and the violent nature of her former employer's murder. The prison system stripped away what little dignity remained, leaving her isolated from the outside world. Years into her incarceration, signs of deep psychological trauma began to surface. Initially defiant, Insisting she acted out of desperation rather than premeditation, Claire gradually expressed remorse. Within the confines of her cell, she wrestled with her guilt and wrote letters of apology to the Harris family. These letters went unanswered. A rare attempt to issue a public apology through the media was met with complete silence. The Harris family, still grieving, had no desire to engage with the woman who had shattered their lives, despite being branded a cold-blooded murderer. A small number of Claire's former colleagues maintained that she was a victim of circumstance. They highlighted her spiraling gambling addiction and financial woes as factors that overwhelmed her judgment and led to her fatal decision. These voices, however, remained in the minority. The prevailing narrative cast Claire as a calculating betrayer who consciously chose to end Vincent's life, a choice that could never be undone. Meanwhile, Vincent Harris's memory gradually faded from the public eye, replaced by newer scandals and headlines for those who had known him personally. However, his death remained a defining chapter. Many of Vincent's business partners, some who had once benefited from his investments, began distancing themselves from his legacy. Some sought to capitalize on the void he left, taking over projects he had initiated and rebuilding their own networks in the real estate world. Vincent's death became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, the brutal realities of the business world, and the betrayals that can lie hidden beneath the glamorous surface of success. Some former associates, once inspired by Vincent as a mentor, began re-examining their own ethics and decisions in the wake of his passing. For many, Vincent Harris came to symbolize the complex intersection of ambition and morality, a man whose life and death highlighted the fragile balance between success and integrity. Unchecked ambition had led Vincent Harris into perilous territory, making him vulnerable even to betrayal by those closest to him. For Claire Thompson, the years behind bars became a long and difficult reckoning. She made efforts to engage in rehabilitation programs, working through her mental health struggles and long-standing battles with addiction. Yet, the road to redemption proved elusive. Taking a life was a weight that could not be lifted with good intentions. Alone, Claire attempted to participate in prison outreach initiatives, hoping her story might serve as a cautionary tale, an example of personal reform. While some inmates saw in her a figure from whom they could learn, others refused to look past the brutality of her crime. Her desire to make amends was genuine, but the shadow of what she had done was impossible to escape with each passing year. Claire's remorse deepened, but no amount of sorrow could bring Vincent Harris back. Vincent's murder had sent shockwaves through more than just his family, had left a scar on his business associates, his community, and the city of Brooklyn itself. The layers of deception, financial desperation, and broken trust that culminated in his death became part of the city's darker history, a chilling reminder of how greed and ambition, when left unchecked, can distort judgment and destroy lives in the end. Claire Thompson's story could never fully be one of redemption, nor could it offer closure to those she had harmed. Her life, like Vincent's, had been irrevocably altered by the choices she made, and the consequences of those choices would linger for the rest of her days. As for the people who had known and loved Vincent Harris, they would carry the weight of his absence always. His life, so full of promise and power, had ended in violence and betrayal, and those left behind would never truly move on from the sudden and devastating loss.